begin in the cold waters that press against the Jutland Peninsula and the islands of Zealand, Funen, and Bornholm. Here, in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, scattered Danish chieftains ruled from timber halls, and their people lived by farming, fishing, and increasingly, by the sea. Long before a centralized kingdom took shape, the Danes were already looking outward. The coastline was not a barrier. It was a road. Deep fjords, island chains, and steady winds made it easier to travel by ship than by land. Geography nudged the Danes toward the water, and the water carried them toward power. The earliest Danish power centers were not grand stone capitals, but busy market towns. Hedeby, near the base of Jutland by the narrow neck of the Baltic, and Ribe on the North Sea side, grew into thriving ports. Merchants from Frisia, the Frankish realms, the Baltic tribes, and the Slavic Wends gathered there with furs, amber, wax, slaves, and metalwork. Archaeologists at Hedeby have uncovered workshops for comb makers, glass bead artisans, and shipbuilders, along with coins from the Islamic world and the Carolingian Empire. Those coins tell a story. Silver from far to the east and south streamed into Danish markets, paying for goods, paying for ships, and paying for warriors. The Danes did not sail only to trade. They raided, and sometimes they settled. When a storm of ships hit the English coast at Lindisfarne, the North remembered it. The scholar Alcuin, writing in the wake of that attack, warned that never before has such terror appeared. He was speaking of Northmen in general, but the Danes were central players in this new maritime age. They probed along the English and Frankish coasts, learning harbors, tides, and weaknesses. Raiding was not just theft, it was training for leadership. A chieftain who could lead successful voyages gathered treasure, fame, and loyal men. Those men swore oaths, and their oaths could be mobilized in the politics of Denmark itself. At the same time, the Danes looked south toward the Frankish Empire. The Carolingians were strong on land and organized around fortified towns and royal courts. To the Danes, that power was both threat and opportunity. The border fortifications known as the Danevirke, a long defensive earthwork stretching across southern Jutland, signaled that the Danes expected pressure from the south and intended to resist it. The Danevirke was extended and strengthened across the 9th century. Its earth and timber ramparts were not just military obstacles, they were expressions of a community deciding where it ended and where others began. In this sense, the frontier helped define Denmark before Denmark had a single, undisputed king. The 9th century also brings the first named Danish rulers who tried to act like kings rather than mere local lords. A figure remembered as King Godfred emerges in Frankish annals as a formidable opponent. He threatened the Frisians, moved merchants from one port to another to control trade, and confronted the empire of Charlemagne and his heirs. Godfred's actions show the pattern: control the markets, command the seaways, and bargain hard with the great power to the south. When Godfred died, rivals contested the throne. Royal authority in Denmark was not yet stable. Kingship depended on personal force, family alliances, and the ability to reward followers. That meant silver, land, and the promise of victory. Religion also entered the story, not as a sudden conversion, but as a long conversation. The missionary Ansgar, later called the Apostle of the North, made journeys to the Danish world in the early 9th century, visiting Hedeby and trying to plant Christian communities. He won some support, lost it, and won it again, always working on the edges of royal favor. His efforts did not transform Denmark, but they opened channels between Danish leaders and the Latin Christian world. Monks, bishops, and kings were paying attention to each other. That attention mattered because recognition by Christian rulers could be turned into prestige at home, and because the church brought literacy and record-keeping, tools that strengthen government. The Danish longship stands at the center of this early story. It was light, flexible, and fast under sail and oar. Crews could haul it over short portages, slip it up rivers, and beach it almost anywhere. In a time when roads were rough and slow, a fleet of such ships was a mobile army and a diplomatic message. A leader who could build and crew longships signaled wealth and coordination. The craftsmanship seen in ship burials and harbor finds from this era shows organized labor and technical skill. This maritime technology turned chieftains into sea kings, cause met effect when the Danes built networks of trust that crossed water and land. A chieftain's hall was a political hub. Gifts were given, alliances sealed, marriages arranged, and disputes settled by oath and compensation. These halls appear in the archaeology of Jutland and the islands as great timber structures with raised platforms and feasting spaces. From these halls, the Danes looked outward. When English or Frankish kings paid tribute to end raiding seasons, that silver returned to the halls. When merchants paid tolls at river mouths or at Hedeby's gate, that income flowed to the same households. Wealth did not sit idle. It bought more ships, more weapons, and more favor. Over time, that cycle produced a new kind of leadership. Instead of a patchwork of equals, certain houses rose above the rest. By the early 10th century, one of these houses, centered in Jutland, was led by Gorm, remembered as Gorm the Old. The title, the Old, reflects later memory more than age, but the point is clear. He stood at a turning point. Gorm's rule marks the first secure foothold of a dynasty that would impose order on the Danes. He ruled from around Jelling, a settlement in central Jutland that would soon become symbolically important. The choice of an inland base signaled that the king did not only ride the waves, he anchored his power in the Danish heartland, knitting together coast and interior. Why did Gorm succeed where others had failed? Part of the answer lies in timing. The 9th century's turmoil, raids abroad, pressure from the Franks, and rivalries at home had shown the limits of loose confederation. A strong king could coordinate defense, manage tribute, and make treaties. Another part of the answer lies in family strategy. Marriage alliances bound Gorm's line to other powerful clans. Kin networks across Jutland and the islands allowed his authority to be recognized in more places, and recognition was half the battle. Finally, Gorm's court likely controlled key nodes of trade, especially Hedeby and the routes that linked it to the North Sea and the Baltic. Whoever set the rules in those markets held influence far beyond a single village. The Danes of this period were not a monolithic people. They were a collection of communities bound by language, custom, and overlapping loyalties. Law was not written in national codes, but spoken at assemblies, where free men debated disputes and announced settlements. These things, as they were called, were basic institutions of order. A king who ignored them risked rebellion. A king who used them wisely could extend his reach. Gorm's generation learned how to stand above the things without breaking them, using local leaders as partners. In this way, royal power seeped into places it had not been before, while still appearing to honor tradition. As the 10th century opened, the Danish world faced new opportunities and new dangers. To the east, along the Baltic, Slavic polities hardened and traded. To the north, Norse settlers pushed across the North Atlantic. To the west, the English kingdoms grew stronger and began to resist Viking pressure more effectively. The Danes had to choose where to focus. Increasingly, they looked south and east, where control of the straits and the Baltic approaches promised steady revenue. Hedeby's location near the narrow passage between the Baltic and the North Sea gave the Danes leverage. Ships that wanted to move from one sea to the other had to pass close to Danish power. That geography would have political consequences for centuries. Even in this early stage, the Danish elite understood the value of infrastructure. Bridges, causeways, and fortified sites began to appear in greater number. Although the grand ring forts that later kings would build belonged to the next chapter of the story, the habit of investing in defenses and communications had already begun. Fortified sites guarded river mouths and trade routes. Watchmen could signal threats. These projects did not just protect, they organized. They brought laborers together, trained craftsmen, and put royal agents in contact with local communities. Every rampart and bridge strengthened the network that held the realm together. Warfare shaped the political map, but did not wholly define it. Danes also negotiated. Envoys crossed to the courts of German rulers to make peace, fix borders, or trade prisoners. Churchmen moved with them, arguing for the protection of Christian merchants and for permission to preach. The Danes handled these requests with care. Christianity was both a spiritual proposition and a political tool. Accepting missionaries could win friends and gain legitimacy. It could also threaten the authority of traditional priests and the rituals that tied local elites to their followers. In this period, Danish rulers managed a balancing act, open enough to benefit from contact, cautious enough to keep control at home. A human moment helps us see that balancing act. When Ansgar first won permission to preach at Hedeby, it was because a Danish ruler calculated that allowing a church might bring trade and favor from the empire. When that ruler died, support evaporated, and the fragile Christian foothold was torn down. Nothing here was inevitable. Choices mattered. Each new king judged the risks differently, and their decisions shifted Denmark's place in the northern world. These choices also reveal something deeper. Early Danish kingship was pragmatic. It used every tool available, ships, silver, marriage, ritual, and religion, to build a larger structure than any single hall or harbor. When Gorm's line secured a foothold in Jutland, the next step was taken by his son, Harald Bluetooth. His reign belongs to the middle and later decades of the 10th century, a time when the Danish realm was no longer a loose net of sea chiefs, but on its way to becoming a state. Harald's project was simple to state and hard to execute. Knit land and islands together, speak with one royal voice to neighbors, and anchor that voice in a new faith that promised legitimacy, literacy, and allies. The tools he chose, forts, bridges, coins, stone inscriptions, and the church, tell us exactly how he planned to rule. Begin at Jelling, the inland site that had already become a stage for royal memory. Here, two great mounds faced each other across a central space, and between them rose runestones. One smaller stone commemorated Queen Thyra, celebrated as Denmark's strength. The larger monument, raised by Harald, did something new. Its carved text named him king over all the Danes and the Norwegians, and declared that he had made the Danes Christian. The stone also showed a figure of Christ, not as an abstract symbol, but as a human body, bending and alive. In one object, Harald pressed together ancestry, conquest, and conversion. It was a public claim that his rule reached farther than any local hall, and that it rested on more than oaths. It was blessed and witnessed by a faith that connected Denmark to the wider world. The Jelling claim did not stand alone. Across Denmark, royal buildings surged in the later 10th century. Archaeologists have uncovered a distinctive set of circular fortresses, perfect rings with gates facing the 4 points of the compass, surrounded by strong earthworks and filled with neat grids of longhouses. Places later called Trelleborg, Agersborg, Fyrkat, and Nannabakken share the same design and seem to have sprung up within a tight window of years. Their geometry was not an artistic flourish, it was a message. Only a ruler with disciplined engineers, trained labor, and reliable supply could stamp such identical shapes onto the landscape. The forts watched over key sea lanes and river crossings. They could shelter royal troops, store provisions, and impress allies and rivals alike. In their order and speed, they looked like the longship translated onto land, swift, coordinated, and under command. Harald's eye for connections extended to roads and bridges. At Ravning-Enge, near the Vejle River, workers laid an astonishing timber causeway across marshy ground. The bridge was long, straight, and heavy, built to carry carts and men quickly along a chosen line. Like the ring forts, it was both useful and symbolic. It turned soft ground into firm policy and demonstrated that the crown could mobilize forests, tools, and hands wherever the realm required. Moving troops and messages more quickly meant the king could appear where trouble stirred and could press his will over distance. Infrastructure became a kind of quiet weapon. Foreign policy forced Harald to sharpen that weapon. To the south, the Ottonian emperors ruled a powerful German realm. Otto the First, crowned emperor in the middle of the 10th century, claimed leadership in Latin Christendom, and kept a watchful eye on the northern frontier. The long earthwork of the Danevirke still marked Denmark's southern line, but the balance of power had shifted since the days of the Carolingians. German bishops and counts pressed into the borderlands, and Christian missionaries claimed a right to preach among the Danes. Conflict flared. In one campaign, imperial forces pushed north, and Danish leaders learned how costly it could be to fight a land empire that could feed armies through settled fields and fortified towns. Harold read the lesson. He did not surrender independence, but he adjusted strategy. Embracing Christianity promised to ease pressure from the south by turning a religious confrontation into a family affair. If Denmark were Christian, imperial rulers could no longer claim war as a holy duty. Disputes would be matters for negotiation, not conversion by the sword. Conversion also brought practical gains. The church carried writing. Royal letters, charters, and law codes could travel farther and bind more tightly when scratched on parchment. Clergy could help collect taxes, manage archives, and educate a new class of officials. In short, the cross was not only a sign of faith, it was a toolkit for government. A story from later tradition captures this turn. It tells of a missionary named Popo who proved the truth of his faith by carrying red-hot iron without harm, persuading Harold to accept baptism. Whether the ordeal happened as told does not matter as much as the memory it carried. The Danes remembered that their king weighed evidence and made a choice, and that the choice was dramatic enough to echo across centuries. What we can trace firmly is the pattern that followed. Churches rose at key sites. Bishops connected Denmark to the Archbishopric of Hamburg and Bremen. Clergy learned the local tongue and preached, while royal authority defended them. This was statecraft set to sacred music. Coins changed, too. In earlier generations, Danish markets had relied on foreign silver, often cut into pieces and weighed on scales. Under Harold, minting began to carry royal symbols and Christian marks. Crosses appeared on coin faces. The message was immediate. The king guaranteed weight and purity, and he did so under the sign of the new faith. Coinage reforms helped the crown control markets, pay soldiers, and gather taxes. In a maritime realm where trade stitched towns together, the person who stamped the silver also stamped the rules. Harold's reach extended across the straits and islands. He cultivated authority in Zealand and in the Skåne region across the strait, and he kept a firm grip on the routes that threaded between the Baltic and the North Sea. The forts and bridges make sense only if we imagine a ruler who cared about moving swiftly from Jutland to the islands and back, from coast to interior and out again. He also looked toward Norway, where dynastic struggles offered chances for influence. Later saga tradition speaks of forced conversions and alliances sealed by hostages, but here caution is wise. The sources are late and colored by storytelling. What stands clear is that Harold's claim to rule the Norwegians, carved at Jelling, expresses a real ambition to shape politics across the Skagerrak and to command a north-south maritime corridor. At home, the fabric of rule thickened. Local assemblies still mattered, and great families still held land and honor, but royal agents became more present. Where a ring fort rose, a market might grow under royal oversight. Where a church was planted, a bishop's network might carry news to the court and carry commands out again. Law codes began to settle into more stable forms, and royal gifts, grants of land, exemptions from tolls, or permissions to hold markets, were written down. The king who could show a charter could defend a decision long after the feast ended and the memories of witnesses faded. Harold's program had a cost. Building forts and bridges required labor and timber. Minting coins required silver. Supporting clergy required endowments. To pay for these, the crown leaned on tolls, on market dues, and on obligations owed by landholders and farmers. Such demands worked so long as victories continued and roads stayed safe. When pressures rose, resentment mounted. The most dangerous pressure came from within Harold's own family. His son, Sweyn, later called Forkbeard, gathered support among nobles and warriors who felt pushed aside by the king's tight circle of advisors and by new taxes tied to building campaigns. The conflict grew from private quarrel to public rebellion. In the end, the son drove the father from power. Harold died in exile, wounded and on the run, if later accounts can be trusted. The fall of a builder king might look like a failure, but the structures he left behind did not fall with him. The ring forts still guarded road and sea. The bridge still crossed the marsh. The coins still carried the cross. The church still kept its books and taught its pupils to read the law. Even a victorious rebel had to use these tools because they worked. In this sense, Harold's greatest success was not a single battle or a single treaty. It was the creation of a system that outlived him. Why does this matter for the story of a Danish empire? Because empires, especially maritime empires, demand rhythm and reach. They need to move information fast, to project force suddenly, and to integrate far-flung markets without losing control. Harold's Denmark learned how to do those things on a smaller stage. The circle forts rehearsed the logistics of concentration and supply. The bridge rehearsed the art of cutting across difficult ground. The coinage rehearsed how to standardize value and tax flows. The church rehearsed bureaucratic memory. When later kings turned west toward England or south toward the Baltic, they drew on the habits he had set. Harold's reign also defined how Danish rulers would present themselves. The gelling inscriptions were not private boasts. They were public contracts. They promised protection and order, and they named the sources of that order. One source was lineage, the line back through Gorm and Thyra. Another was faith, the cross carved in stone and stamped in silver. A third was architecture, the way a perfect circle on a hill could say, without words, that the king's will was precise and strong. This multi-layered message helped Denmark speak to two audiences at once. To neighbors it said, "We are a Christian kingdom, part of your world, not an outlaw shore." To subjects it said, "Your king stands on firm ground and can defend you." Sweyn Forkbeard came to power in a Denmark already changed by fortresses, bridges, and Christian symbols. Yet his ambition pointed in a different direction. Where his father had built inward, Sweyn looked outward toward sea lanes that linked the Skagerrak to the Thames and beyond. His rise marks a turn from consolidation to projection. The question he answered, first with raids and then with crowns, was simple. Could a Danish ruler take the maritime habits learned at home and apply them across the entire North Sea world? Sweyn's method was to turn pressure into opportunity. In the English kingdoms, the long strain of coastal attacks and tribute had hollowed confidence in the reign of King Ethelred, remembered by later writers as the unready. Royal payments to buy peace had trained fleets to expect silver rather than resistance. That policy, called tribute by the English and a war payment by the Danes, funded larger expeditions, better ships, and tighter coordination among captains. When Sweyn organized his forces, he could draw on crews hardened by years of seasonal warfare. A pattern that had once been a nuisance had become a system. The trigger that moved Sweyn from raider to would-be conqueror was a brutal decision made in England. On a St. Brice's Day in the early 11th century, Ethelred ordered the killing of Danes living in several English towns, claiming to strike first against a supposed plot. Among the dead, sources later said, was a woman connected to Sweyn's own family. Whether that detail is exact or not, the larger effect is clear. The killings ended any illusion that the English king could manage the Danish presence with payments and diplomacy. Sweyn now had both a cause and a signal that English defenses were brittle. What followed were campaigns that felt less like raids and more like rolling sieges, with fleets overwintering, taking hostages, and demanding terms. Sweyn's conquest of England was swift once the political ground gave way. London held out for a time, but English nobles weighed their options, measured the king's strength, and defected. Ethelred fled overseas. Sweyn was accepted as king across much of the realm. For a moment, the North Sea had a single master. Then fate intervened. Sweyn died unexpectedly after only a short time on the English throne, leaving a realm taken but not yet settled. Power rushed into the gap. The English recalled Ethelred. Sweyn's son, Cnut, faced a choice: abandon the prize or try again on a larger scale. Cnut chose the harder path. He withdrew long enough to gather the means for a decisive return. That choice already tells us something about him. He was not only a war leader, he was a manager of time and resources. When he sailed back to England, he came with a heavy fleet, a clear plan, and the patience to fight through a campaign season that stretched from landings on the coast to pitched battles inland. English resistance rallied around Edmund Ironside, a fierce and capable prince who refused to concede. The two sides met in repeated clashes, each probing the other's strength and alliances. At Asandun, Cnut's forces won the day. The victory did not end the war by itself, but it opened the door to a settlement that divided the realm between the two rivals. Shortly afterward, Edmund died, and the whole of England acknowledged Cnut. With the English crown secure, Cnut faced the task that reveals a ruler's depth: how to govern a land gained by force in a way that breeds consent. He moved quickly to secure legitimacy. He married Emma of Normandy, the widow of Ethelred, linking himself to the old royal house and to the Norman court across the Channel. He confirmed laws, restored church property seized in the fighting, and presented himself not as a foreign conqueror but as a Christian king who would keep peace and right. His charters speak the steady language of rule rather than the fire of victory. He promised equal law to both English and Danes, and he summoned councils where bishops and earls could witness royal decisions. The message was deliberate. The storm had passed. There would be order. Cnut's order rested on more than words. He kept a royal fleet ready by levying a ship tax, known in English usage as the herregeld, to fund sailors and maintain vessels. In a seaborne empire, control of the water was as important as castles on land. With a paid navy, he could respond to threats quickly and make rebellion risky. He also shaped the great earldoms that divided England's administration, placing trusted men, among them Godwin in Wessex, at the head of regional power. These earls owed their stations to him, and they understood that their fortunes moved with his. In this, Cnut repeated a pattern familiar from Danish politics: bind ambitious leaders by giving them large responsibilities that only the crown can grant. Coinage told the same story in metal. English mints, already among the most productive in Europe, placed Cnut's name and titles on new issues, often paired with Christian symbols. The silver you spent at a market stall or received as wages in a garrison carried the face and promise of the new king. Regular recoinage, a long-standing English practice, brought older pieces back to the mint, where they were replaced with current designs and subject to fresh charges. This cycle not only funded government, it kept the royal image in every trader's hand. Beyond England, Cnut moved to secure the other corners of his father's ambition. In Denmark, his brother Harald II had taken the throne after Sweyn's death. When Harald II died without heirs, Cnut stepped into the Danish kingship, uniting the two realms under one ruler. He did not rule them as a single fused kingdom, each kept its own laws and offices. But his person linked them, and the sea between became less a boundary than a royal road. From ports in Jutland and Zealand to the harbors of the English coast, officials, priests, merchants, and messages moved with unusual ease. This was the practical meaning of a thalassocracy. The sea as connective tissue. Norway became the third strand. There, Olaf II Haraldsson had built a royal authority grounded in Christian kingship and force, pushing against earls who held older ties to Denmark and to powerful families in the Norwegian fjords. Cnut challenged him by assembling allies among those earls, by applying naval pressure, and by leveraging his English and Danish resources. A clash off the coast of Scania at Helge signaled that Cnut could match combined Scandinavian fleets. Later, with the weight of his system behind him, he forced Olaf to flee. Norwegian elites accepted Cnut's rule and his appointees, and for a time the entire northwestern rim of Europe listened to one court. What made this empire work, if only for a generation, was the calibration of force and inclusion. Cnut punished traitors at the start, making examples that discouraged further plots. Yet he also forgave, restored lands, and married his family into local houses. His first partner, Ælfgifu of Northampton, remained an instrument of policy. Placed with their son in the north, she worked to secure loyalty in regions where Danish influence was strong. Emma of Normandy brought a different set of ties and, with her son Harthacnut, connected Cnut's rule to continental diplomacy. The royal household became a web of negotiated loyalties. Religion supplied another pillar. Cnut presented himself as a humble Christian king, penitent for the bloodshed that had brought him power and eager to honor the church. He endowed monasteries, supported bishops, and made a celebrated pilgrimage to Rome. There, he met the Pope and secured promises that mattered to his subjects. Fair treatment for English pilgrims traveling to the shrines of the city and for traders passing through imperial toll stations. His public letter describing the journey is sober and political. He tells his people what he obtained and why it will ease their burdens. The voyage was not just piety, it was policy, conducted in a language respected across borders. At home, the law was refined. The laws of Cnut drew on earlier English codes but clarified penalties, protected the church, and stressed the king's duty to keep the peace. By aligning himself with the legal memory of the land he had conquered, Cnut turned victory into continuity. People care less about a ruler's origin than about whether disputes are judged fairly and roads are safe. The promise of predictable justice bought time for a foreign dynasty to become familiar. There were cracks. North Sea empires are expensive. They demand fleets, garrisons, and gifts. They also depend on the person of the ruler to keep far-flung elites cooperating. Cnut managed this balance through attention and travel. He held assemblies in different regions, showed himself in key ports, and kept the fyrd, the militia system, responsive. But even for a strong king, distance and weather were facts that no decree could abolish. Storms delayed messages. Rivalries flared while the court was elsewhere. The system worked so long as the center remained vigorous. Cnut's death revealed the limits. He left two principal sons who embodied the twin lines of his household. Harold Harefoot, born of Ælfgifu, had strong backing in parts of England. Harthacnut, born of Emma, held Denmark and a claim to the English throne. The realm that Cnut had managed as a personal union now threatened to split along family and regional lines. While Harthacnut was delayed in Denmark, Harold Harefoot took the English crown. After Harold's death, Harthacnut crossed, ruled England briefly, and then died in his turn. This rapid succession unsettled loyalties and reopened questions thought closed. Across the North Sea, Norway threw off Danish control under Magnus, remembered as the Good, a prince who drew on the memory of Olaf II's martyrdom and on the fatigue of Norwegian elites with outside rule. In Denmark, the throne passed to Sweyn Estridsson, a nephew of Cnut, who struggled against Magnus and then found his footing after Magnus's early death. The elegant triangle that Cnut had formed, England, Denmark, Norway, had collapsed into separate projects, each with its own wars and bargains. The North Sea was still a highway, but it no longer had a single tollkeeper. After the North Sea Empire dissolved, Denmark entered a long season of uncertainty. Great men quarreled, provinces slipped from steady control, and neighbors watched for advantage. Out of that disorder came a new direction. The center of Danish strategy turned away from the English focus of Sweyn and Cnut and toward the Baltic. The leaders who drove this pivot were a warrior king from the house later called Valdemar and a churchman who rode and fought like a seasoned captain. Together, Valdemar the First and Archbishop Absalon rebuilt power, not by reviving the old North Sea project, but by mastering the straits, markets, and shorelines of the Baltic world. The roots of their program lay in a hard lesson. During the mid-12th century, Danish magnates struggled for the crown, and rival claimants drew in outside forces. German princes pushed up from the Elbe, and the great Saxon duke known as Henry the Lion leaned on the Slavic coast. Wendish raiders, sailing from islands such as Rügen, struck at Zealand and the Sound, burning churches and seizing captives. Each raid did more than take plunder. It cut trade and confidence. If fishermen feared to launch their boats and merchants hesitated to load their casks, revenue failed and garrisons went unpaid. Disorder at home invited pressure from abroad, and pressure from abroad fed new disorder at home. Denmark needed a strategy that could break this loop. Valdemar the First rose in this landscape as a coalition builder. He secured the throne by bargaining with rival families and by presenting himself as the man who could restore safety at sea. His closest ally was Absalon, first bishop of Roskilde and later archbishop of Lund. Absalon was no cloistered figure. He planned campaigns, negotiated with princes, and strapped on mail when the fleet put out. The two men understood that the Baltic could not be pacified by defensive gestures alone. A king who sat behind earthworks would bleed slowly. The only real answer to sea raiding was to take the fight to the harbors that sheltered the raiders and to dismantle the sacred and political authority that justified their attacks. The most famous stroke came against the fortress and cult center at Arkona on the island of Rügen. There, a towering image of the god Svantevit crowned a temple where Slavic elites combined religion and rule. Absalon and Valdemar chose their moment, landed their forces, and carried the walls by assault. When the temple fell, they destroyed the idol and compelled the islanders to accept baptism and Danish overlordship. The act was both military and symbolic. It broke a base for piracy, and it announced that the Danish crown would now wield the language of crusade on its own coast. The wider world noticed. Popes had earlier blessed campaigns against pagans in the north during the Great Crusading wave that began in the middle of the 12th century. Denmark now placed itself inside that moral frame, aligning its security needs with the Church's declared mission. The victory at Arkona opened a chain of submissions along the southern Baltic shore. Danish fleets, operating with speed learned from longship traditions but armed and organized in new ways, forced other Wendish strongholds to accept tribute and to pull down their pagan cults. Tribute here did not simply line royal coffers. It funded the ships that kept the sea lanes quiet. Markets responded. The herring runs in the Øresund drew crowds again, and with them came the tolls and rents that strengthen a treasury. Villages that had flickered with fear began to steady. In this cause and effect rhythm, strike the bases, tame the water, rebuild the markets, the Baltic pivot took form. At the same time, Valdemar and Absalon invested in place. On a small island in the channel that cuts through Copenhagen, Absalon raised a fortress. The site controlled a narrow throat through which Baltic and North Sea traffic had to pass. Fortification bred settlement. Craftsmen and traders clustered where protection and opportunity met. Over time, that strong point would evolve into the royal heart of Copenhagen. The choice of location said everything about the new Danish project. Defend the strait, tax the flow, and let commerce feed power. The Church's role in this rebuild deserves attention. The Archbishopric of Lund, seated in Scania, had become the leading see of the Nordic lands earlier in the century. Under Absalon, it acted as a hinge between spiritual reform and political consolidation. Tithes and estates gave the Church resources to support ships and soldiers. In return, the Crown defended church rights and used clerical scribes to record grants, laws, and treaties. This partnership was not merely pious. Writing stabilized agreements across distance and time. When a king granted a market or a noble swore homage, a parchment bore witness long after memories could be bent by self-interest. The habits of literacy that had been planted under Harold now matured into an administrative backbone fit for Baltic rule. German politics also shaped Danish choices. The emperors of the Ottonian and Salian lines had given way to the Hohenstaufen, and emperors such as Frederick the First and his successors watched the Baltic frontier while wrestling with Italian wars. In that slackening gaze, regional powers like Henry the Lion rose high and then fell. Valdemar and Absalon handled these shifts with careful timing. When Henry the Lion stood strong, they bargained. When he fell from favor and was broken by the emperor, they edged forward. This was the difficult art of being a northern kingdom beside a continental empire. Know when to bow, when to wait, and when to move. By the late 12th century, Danish fleets and garrisons stood along the southern coast from Holstein to Pomerania, not always as direct rulers, but often as overlords who took homage and tribute. The aim was not to absorb every harbor into the kingdom. The aim was to create a belt of clients and allies that would keep the raiders down and the markets open. Even so, such reach demanded resources. The crown leaned on the old naval levy, calling free farmers to cruise ships and serve in summer expeditions. It also rewarded new men, captains and officials who proved their worth, with land and privilege. A service nobility began to take shape, bound to the throne by opportunity rather than only by ancestry. As the 13th century opened, a new king, Valdemar II, carried the project forward and then beyond. Known to later memory as the Victorious, he inherited not only a throne but a strategy. He held the straits, tightened the web of clientage on the southern shores, and looked farther east. Campaigns pushed into the lands that would later be called Estonia. At a battlefield near Lindenice, Danish arms won a sharp success against local forces. A later legend tells that a red banner with a white cross fell from the sky to bless the victory, the flag that Danes now call the Dannebrog. As a story, it speaks to identity and faith. As history, what matters is that the campaign planted a Danish foothold on the far side of the Baltic and fused crusading language with expansion. This peak, however, carried risk. Stretch too far, and the web snaps. Counts in the German marches resented Danish claims. Rival princes watched for moments of weakness. One such moment arrived when Valdemar II was seized during a hunt by Count Henry of Schwerin. The capture was a masterstroke of opportunism. Held for ransom, the king was forced into harsh terms that included heavy payments and the surrender of several gains along the southern coast. He returned to freedom, but the aura of inevitability around Danish advance had thinned. Soon after, a coalition of German and Allied forces met the Danes in battle near Bornhoved. There, Danish arms suffered a damaging defeat. Much that had been won on the southern mainland slipped away. The Baltic Empire did not collapse, but it narrowed. Denmark kept its core and its new eastern foothold, yet the dream of permanent lordship over the German shore was set back. Setbacks can instruct. Valdemar II turned inward to strengthen institutions. In Jutland, a great law code was compiled and promulgated, setting out rights, procedures, and penalties. This Jutland law did more than tidy disputes. It expressed a view of the realm where royal justice, local customs, and written norm worked together. A monarch who could not hold every conquered port might still shape how people lived and traded at home. In that sense, legal reform was a strategic retreat to more solid ground, making the core resilient while borders shifted. Meanwhile, trade changed its shape. German merchants, especially from towns that would soon knit themselves into the Hanseatic League, developed disciplined networks. They brought salt, cloth, and metal goods to the north and carried back fish, timber, and furs. Danish rulers understood that fighting every merchant city was foolish. Better to steer the flow through the Sound and to take dues where the geography helped. Though the famous Sound dues would be formalized in a later age, the core idea, use the strait as a lever, was already part of royal thinking. Copenhagen's growing importance reflected that logic. A watchful fortress and a busy market could do as much to project power as a distant garrison, and at far lower cost. Religion continued to shape public life. Monasteries in Scania, Zealand, and Jutland drained wetlands, cleared forests, and taught new methods of farming. These changes mattered for power because they increased the surplus that could be taxed and because they tied local communities to larger networks of credit and exchange. When kings borrowed grain or silver from an abbey to pay troops, they leaned on the productivity that monks and lay brothers had built. In return, royal protection allowed church lands to flourish. The partnership was not frictionless. Jurisdictional quarrels flared, but it was mutually profitable. Culturally, the court projected a new tone, Chronicles written at monasteries near royal centers began to tell Denmark's story as a rising arc, from sea rovers to Christian kings, from raids endured to missions led. Skaldic and Latin traditions met, mixing praise poetry with analytic prose. This merger of voices gave the realm a shared memory, one that justified the Baltic turn and explained setbacks as trials on the way to a providential role. Identity hardens when it has a narrative, and the Valdemar age supplied one. At the turn from the late 14th century into the early 15th century, Scandinavia's map was redrawn by a single, patient strategist, Margaret the First. She did not inherit an empire ready-made. She assembled it, piece by piece, through guardianship, council politics, and war conducted with careful timing. The result was the Kalmar Union, a dynastic arrangement that placed Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under one monarch while keeping each kingdom's laws and identities intact. From this point, the Danish story becomes the story of a composite monarchy that controlled the straits, watched the Baltic, and held the North Atlantic islands in a single political frame. The starting conditions explain why the union became possible. The Black Death had drained populations and shaken old balances. Noble families held wide estates, but needed a strong protector to keep revenue flowing and borders secure. Merchant cities on the southern Baltic, especially the league led by Lübeck, pushed deep into northern markets, buying fish, furs, and timber, and selling cloth and metal wares. In this climate, scattered Scandinavian crowns struggled to match the bargaining power and naval coordination of the merchants. Margaret's vision was that one throne, accepted across three kingdoms, could negotiate from strength, discipline the nobility, and set the terms at the straits. Her path to that throne ran through family roles that she turned into power. As a princess of Denmark who married Håkon VI of Norway, she stood at the hinge between two realms. Their son, Olaf II of Denmark and the IV of Norway, came to the Danish throne as a child. Margaret ruled as regent, building her network among Danish lords and bishops. When Olaf died young, her authority did not collapse. She stepped forward as ruler in her own right, confirmed by the councils that mattered. In Norway, where her husband had been king, she took the guardianship as well. Sweden remained the hard case, ruled by King Albert of Mecklenburg, whose German ties and heavy hand stirred resentment among Swedish nobles. Margaret's campaign against Albert was a study in coalition. She worked with Swedish factions that wanted to curtail foreign influence and restore local privileges. When forces met near Falköping, Swedish allies and Danish support prevailed. Albert was captured, and Sweden fell into Margaret's orbit. Now, with councils in all three kingdoms prepared to recognize her political lead, she advanced a plan to settle the succession and the shape of the union. She chose and adopted a teenage kinsman from Pomerania, Bogislaw, and brought him north as Eric of Pomerania, the heir who would be crowned over the three realms. The coronation took place at Kalmar in the year spelled out as 1497. The setting mattered. Kalmar sat on Sweden's southeast coast, a stone castle guarding approaches to the Baltic. There, lords and clergy from the three kingdoms gathered to swear oaths and hear charters read. The union's terms were clear on essential points. Each realm kept its own laws, its own councils, and its own tax traditions. Offices should go to natives of each kingdom, but foreign policy would be common, and the monarch would hold all three crowns. The logic was to keep domestic identity while uniting strength abroad. Why did this matter? Because the union changed the bargaining table. No single Scandinavian kingdom dominated the Baltic on its own. Together, they could challenge the Hanseatic League, negotiate with German princes on the Elbe and Oder, and hold the Sound, that narrow blue throat between Zealand and Scania through which ships passed from the Baltic to the North Sea. With Norway included, the Union also brought the North Atlantic dependencies, the Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland, under the same royal umbrella. One crown could now speak for a northern arc that stretched from the ice-laced seas to the herring markets of the Øresund. Margaret's style of rule emphasized stability at home as the foundation for strength abroad. Her watchwords, recorded in later memory, were peace and good coin. She stabilized currency after years of debasement, brought roving captains to heel, and reclaimed royal lands that had drifted into private hands during earlier turmoil. She governed through councils of the realm, not by sweeping decrees from above. That mattered because the union depended on noble consent. If Danish lords felt overridden by Swedes, or Norwegian elites felt ignored by Danes, the whole structure could wobble. Margaret's answer was to consult, to balance, and to distribute patronage with an even hand. She moved carefully when naming bishops and castle governors, often choosing men with reputations for competence rather than kinship alone. Yet Margaret also understood the power of symbolism. She traveled, appearing in key towns and strongholds to receive homage and hear petitions. She presented herself as a Christian ruler whose legitimacy rested on oath, law, and service to the common peace. In a time when rulers often claimed rights by birth and conquest, she added a language of stewardship, the crown as guardian of the land's order. This language built trust among merchants who needed safe roads, among farmers who needed fair courts, and among clergy who sought protections for their tithes and schools. When Eric of Pomerania came of age and took the reins, the union shifted into an outward posture. He faced a world of opportunities and threats. The Hanseatic cities were strong, with fleets that could embargo trade or raid rival ports. German principalities along the southern Baltic looked for chances to open or close markets. To meet these pressures, Eric moved to turn geography into policy. In the year spelled out as 1429, he established the sound dues, a toll on every foreign ship passing through the Øresund. The rule was simple. If you traded from the Baltic to the North Sea or returned the other way, you paid. The toll was collected at Helsingør, opposite Helsingborg, where the channel narrows. A fortress would soon rise there to enforce the rule. With this single act, the Union claimed a steady revenue stream tied directly to northern commerce. The dues had wide effects. They funded fleets that could police piracy and demonstrate royal presence. They encouraged merchants to seek good terms at the Sound rather than fight their way around coercive ports on the southern coast. They also angered the League cities, especially Lübeck, which saw a rival tollmaster appear where none had stood before. Conflict followed. Eric waged long wars against the Counts of Holstein and wrestled with the League over control of Schleswig and adjacent lands. War demands taxes, taxes test consent. As campaigns stretched on and costs mounted, councils in Denmark and Sweden grew wary. They measured gains against burdens and began to grumble. Eric's style did not soothe them. Where Margaret had been patient and consultative, Eric could be abrupt and proud. He tightened royal claims, appointed favorites, and spent long periods away from the council's reach, especially on the island of Gotland, where he favored the port of Visby. In Sweden, a revolt led by the nobleman Engelbrekt burst out, fueled by anger at taxes, at foreign officials, and at the treatment of miners and farmers who bore the weight of war. The revolt forced concessions and showed that Swedish elites would not accept union at any cost. In Denmark, leading lords weighed whether they preferred a softer hand at the center. Even as cracks spread, the union remained a formidable force. The sound dues continued to flow. The North Atlantic islands gave Norway, and thus the Union, reach beyond the Baltic quarrels. Iceland's fisheries supplied export goods that League merchants wanted, meaning that the League could not easily afford a total break with the Northern Crown. The Norwegian coast, dotted with harbors from Bergen to Trondheim, provided seafaring skill and timber to feed fleets. In Sweden, when rebellion receded, many nobles still admitted that common defense against foreign intrusion was easier under one monarch. The Union's advantages were real, its frictions were just as real. The councils took a decisive step when they deposed Eric in Denmark and Norway, and later in Sweden. The king retreated to Gotland and turned privateer, a dramatic fall from the center of a three-crown project to a captain on the Baltic Rim. The act of deposition shows both the strength and the weakness of the Union. It was strong enough that councils could imagine replacing a monarch without breaking the idea of a common crown. It was weak enough that replacing the person did not cure structural grievances. After Eric, the lords chose Christopher of Bavaria, a compromise candidate who promised to respect native rights in each kingdom and to govern with counsel. For a short span, the union held together under this gentler touch. The structure that guided these transitions deserves a closer look. Each kingdom maintained a council of leading nobles and bishops, the forums that confirmed kings and shaped policy. These bodies expected to be consulted on taxes and war. They also guarded legal traditions. Danish law books, Swedish provincial laws, and Norwegian codes all had their own rhythms. The union could not harmonize everything without breaking trust. Instead, the monarch relied on shared offices near the person of the crown, chancellors, treasurers, and household officers, and on a web of personal oaths from castle captains and sheriffs in each land. This was governance by negotiated layers. It could work if the monarch listened, kept accounts transparent, and showed military competence when danger appeared. The Kalmar Union had promised stability under one crown, but unions rest on trust, and trust is a fragile thread. After Margaret the First's careful stewardship, the 15th century brought a chain of stresses that frayed that thread. What followed was not a clean split, but a long unspooling of grievances, wars, and political experiments. By the time the story reaches the early decades of the 16th century, Sweden would walk out of the Union for good, and Denmark would face the hard task of redefining its power without its largest partner. The roots of the breakup lay in uneven expectations. Danish councils wanted a union that secured the straits, protected trade, and respected their privileges. Norwegian elites sought protection for their North Atlantic roots and a monarch who would defend their law codes. Swedish nobles and townsmen wanted influence over taxes and offices, especially those tied to the rich mines of Bergslagen and the copper works at Falun. All three kingdoms also watched the southern Baltic, where merchant cities led by Lubeck bargained hard and wielded fleets able to choke commerce. A union could, in theory, meet these demands. In practice, each time the crown leaned on one realm for men or money to solve a crisis elsewhere, resentment grew. After Christopher of Bavaria's short reign, the Danish council chose Christian I of Oldenburg. He brought Norway securely under his crown and accepted Sweden when its factions were willing, but Swedish consent proved episodic. A pattern set in. Swedish regents, often from the Stura line, would govern in the king's absence, then resist tighter royal control when it returned. Sten Sture the Elder stands out in this era as a determined protector of Swedish autonomy. He shored up Stockholm, guarded mining revenues, and balanced nobles and towns against one another. When the crown pressed too hard, especially by appointing foreign-born officials or by seeking to divert Swedish resources for wars on the southern frontier, Sture's coalition closed ranks. Danish kings faced their own humiliations that weakened their hand. King Hans, remembered in Danish as Hans and often styled John in English, attempted to subdue the stubborn peasant republic of Dithmarschen on the North Sea marshes. In the year spelled out as 1500, his army suffered a stinging defeat at Hemmingstedt, where local defenders used dikes and flooded fields to trap the invaders. The loss did more than bruise pride. It exposed limits in royal coordination and drained treasure that might have been used to soothe union politics. When a crown fails abroad, critics at home become bolder. At the same time, the economic landscape shifted. The League cities, while still formidable, were no longer unchallenged. Dutch skippers cut into Baltic trade, carrying grain and timber westward without League intermediation. Danish rulers saw both threat and opportunity. If they could hold the Øresund and collect dues on every hull passing Helsingør, they could fund fleets without asking councils for extraordinary subsidies. But the more the crown relied on tolls and extraordinary levies, the more each kingdom asked where its share of the benefit was. In Sweden, where mining towns depended on steady export routes, any hint that Copenhagen would use the straits as a lever against them fueled suspicion. Into this unsettled field stepped Christian II, son of King Hans, a ruler of sharp talents and harder edges. He had a reformer's impatience with entrenched privilege and a soldier's belief that force could solve what talk delayed. Early in his reign, he made a striking bid to weaken the Hanseatic grip on Danish trade by favoring Dutch merchants and by courting urban craftsmen against their town councils. He also looked inward, pushing for legal reforms that would bind local magnates and defend commoners from abuses. In Denmark, such moves won city support and stirred noble anger. In Sweden, they were read through another lens, as part of a Danish plan to plant compliant officials and skim Swedish wealth. The Swedish stage was already crowded. After Sten Sture the Elder's death, his mantle passed to Svante Nilsson and then to Sten Sture the Younger, both committed to keeping Sweden's council strong and foreign appointees weak. A new figure complicated matters: Archbishop Gustav Trolle of Uppsala. Trolle claimed that Sture's faction had unlawfully besieged and damaged his stronghold at Almarestaket and demanded redress. The Swedish council, fearing that Trolle's loyalties ran toward Copenhagen and Rome rather than Stockholm, deposed him. Christian II seized on this quarrel. Here was a way to split Swedish society, present himself as the defender of church rights and lawful authority, brand Sture and his allies as rebels, and enter Sweden with a banner of restoration. War followed. Christian II led a campaign across the ice and fields of Sweden, pressing hard on Stockholm. Sten Sture the Younger fought to hold the capital but fell in battle, a blow that shook his coalition. His widow, Christina Gyllenstierna, took command of the city's defense and became a symbol of civic courage, but the balance of force favored the king. Stockholm, isolated and hungry, capitulated on terms that promised amnesty. The stage seemed set for a conciliatory settlement that would bind Sweden back into the Union under guarantees of law. What came instead burned the Union's bridge. Shortly after his coronation in Stockholm, Christian II allowed a church court to reopen the case against the late Sten Sture's party for alleged heresy connected to their treatment of Archbishop Trolle. Over several days in the year, spelled out as 1520, dozens of Swedish nobles, clergy, and burghers were condemned and executed in the market square. This episode, remembered as the Stockholm bloodbath, shocked the realm. The king justified it as lawful punishment carried out under ecclesiastical authority. His critics saw treachery, since the surrender terms had implied mercy. Law or not, the effect was political disaster. Families across Sweden now had martyrs. The rhetoric of resistance could blend grievance, piety, and patriotism. From this trauma emerged a leader with a clear program. Gustaf Eriksson of the Vasa family had escaped captivity and moved through the forests and farmsteads of Dalarna, stirring support with promises to throw out the Danes and restore Swedish self-rule. He was no mere rebel captain. He understood the mechanics of power: secure the mining districts to finance war, seize key castles to anchor authority, and negotiate with neighbors to keep supplies moving. He cut a deal with Lübeck, trading market privileges for ships and arms. With League support, his forces took town after town along the coast, and Stockholm eventually fell to his coalition. In the year spelled out as 1523, Swedish estates met and elected Gustav Vasa as king. Cause and effect are stark here. The bloodbath intended to terrify opponents instead consolidated them. By violating the spirit of a negotiated surrender, Christian II made reconciliation nearly impossible. By turning a church dispute into mass punishment, he entangled faith and politics in a way that fed outrage. Gustav Vasa, in contrast, offered practical relief. He promised to protect trade, to respect provincial laws, and to work with the council. He also hinted at reforms that would later remake church-state relations in Sweden, though those belonged to the next act of the northern story. Denmark now faced a strategic reckoning. The union that had given it leverage over the Baltic and the North Atlantic was broken. Sweden stood apart, and not as a weak parochial state, but as a kingdom under a disciplined, pragmatic ruler with secure revenue from mines and a working relationship with powerful merchant cities. The Danish crown still held Norway with its fisheries and Atlantic islands, and still controlled the Øresund with its tolls. But the balance of Scandinavian power had shifted. To the east, a rival capable of contesting the Baltic lanes now stood outside Danish councils. Christian II, meanwhile, saw his position crumble at home. His reforming push had alienated many nobles, and his Swedish policy had failed to deliver the promised stability. Lübeck, once his partner of convenience, turned on him when debts and disappointments piled up. Danish lords moved to replace him with his uncle, Frederick the First, a cautious ruler more willing to govern by consent. Christian fled, then returned with support from the Netherlands, only to be defeated and imprisoned. His fall matters for what comes next, but the key point for this section is simpler. The man who tried to hold the Union by force had instead hastened its end. The exit of Sweden reshaped everyday life across the region. Merchants recalculated routes. If the Øresund dues felt too heavy, some shippers gambled on overland transfers to avoid them. Others bargained harder at Helsingør, playing Danish officials against Swedish offers on the northern shore. Coastal towns adjusted their loyalties. In Finland, then part of the Swedish realm, governors looked west to Stockholm rather than south to Copenhagen. In Norway, elites weighed the costs and benefits of staying under the Danish crown now that the Union had shrunk. The answer, for the time being, was that Denmark still offered the most reliable protection and the most predictable law for Norwegian trade. That choice would matter in the coming religious storms. Sweden's break from the Union forced Denmark to face a hard choice: cling to old formulas or build a stronger state with new tools. The answer arrived through a civil war and a religious revolution that together recast the crown's authority. Under Christian III, Denmark embraced Lutheran reform, seized church wealth, rewired administration, and, above all, bound Norway directly to the Danish throne. What began as a fight over who should rule ended as a transformation of how to rule. The crisis opened with the struggle remembered as the Count's Feud, a violent contest between supporters of the deposed Christian II and the forces that rallied around Duke Christian of Schleswig and Holstein, soon to be Christian III. The background mattered. Christian II, driven from power earlier for his heavy hand and for the shock of the Stockholm executions, had found allies abroad. Lübeck's merchant leaders, angry over Danish trade policies and eager to recover old privileges, backed a restoration. In Jutland and on the islands, noble factions split. Towns weighed where their interests lay. The quarrel was not only dynastic, it turned on who would shape law, taxes, and trade in the new century. Between the years spelled out as 1534 and 1536, the fighting pulled in many corners of the realm. Lübeck's ships tried to choke Danish sea lanes. Rebel garrisons held key towns. In response, Jutland nobles and many clergy sided with Duke Christian, reading him as the safer guardian of their estates and customs. The pivot came when his armies tightened a siege on Copenhagen. The capital had leaned toward the restoration and paid dearly for it. Famine and disease followed blockade. When the city finally yielded in the late summer of the year spelled out as 1536, the political map shifted at once. The victory did more than elevate a claimant. It cleared the way for a program that would remake church and state. Christian III moved quickly. In the autumn of that same year, a national assembly in Copenhagen accepted a Lutheran settlement. Bishops loyal to Rome were deposed. Their castles and estates were taken into the hands of the crown. A church ordinance, drafted with guidance from the German reformer Johannes Bugenhagen, would soon lay out the new church's structure, its liturgy, and its schools. In the following year, Bugenhagen crowned Christian and Queen Dorothea in the capital's cathedral, a public sign that the old alliance of king and Latin hierarchy had been replaced by a partnership between monarch and Lutheran clergy. Why did this matter for power? Because land, silver, and literacy moved with the change. Monasteries and bishoprics had long been among the largest landholders in Denmark and Norway. When those lands passed to the crown, revenue followed. Rents in grain and coin now funded shipyards, garrisons, and salaries for officials. The new church, stripped of princely temporal power, still carried schools and script. Pastors preached in Danish and Norwegian, taught children to read, and kept registers of births, marriages, and deaths. That record-keeping strengthened the state's memory, making taxation and justice more regular. In short, the Reformation gave the crown both a treasury and a filing cabinet. Norway stood at the heart of this transformation. With Sweden gone, Denmark could not afford another semi-independent partner who might drift away. In the settlement of the year, spelled out as 1536, Norway was declared a hereditary kingdom under the Danish crown, and its Council of the Realm was effectively dissolved. The last medieval Archbishop of Nidaros, Olav Engelbrektsson, fled into exile the following year after a final attempt to rally resistance. Royal governors and bailiffs took firmer charge of castles like Akershus and Bergenhus. Lutheran pastors replaced the old hierarchy step by step, aided by Danish officials who understood that control of pulpits meant influence in every parish valley. This binding of Norway carried practical consequences. The North Atlantic islands of the Faroes and Iceland, long attached to Norway, came under tighter Danish direction through the new administrative chain. Licenses to trade, rules for fishing, and appointments of lawmen passed through Copenhagen. The effect was not instant uniformity. Local customs remained strong, but the arc bent towards central oversight. Herring, cod, and stockfish still drove local economies, yet now the crown could shape who bought, who sold, and which dues were paid at which harbors. The same logic applied to timber, tar, and ship stores that Norwegian forests supplied. An imperial shape, slimmer than in the age of the wide union but more tightly managed, took form. At home in Denmark, Christian III reorganized governance to match his ambitions. He kept the old fief system of lens, but he used it more deliberately. Trusted men received fiefs not only as rewards, but as administrative offices with clear expectations. Collect dues, keep roads and bridges serviceable, guard the peace, and report accounts in writing. The king's chancery, staffed by educated clerks shaped by the new schools, sent out ordinances that set common standards for weights and measures, for poor relief, for market days, and for the treatment of vagabonds. The slow, steady work of state building became visible in small routines. A quarterly audit here, a uniform toll schedule there, a clerk's neat hand entering fines into a ledger. Law and language shifted together. The Latin of medieval charters gave way to Danish in royal decrees, and soon to Norwegian in local church books. That change lowered the barrier between ruler and ruled. Farmers could hear the law in their tongue at the parish assembly. Townsmen could read posted notices. The crown found it easier to explain new taxes or regulations when they moved in familiar words. A celebrated milestone came with the publication of a full Danish Bible in the year spelled out as 1550, sponsored by the king. Scripture in the vernacular was a religious promise. It was also a cultural policy, knitting the realm with a shared text. Finance underwrote everything. The sound dues at Helsingør, first imposed in the early 15th century and now more efficiently collected, poured steady income into the treasury. Royal officials tightened the system with registers of ship names, cargo types, declared tonnage, and ports of origin. Disputes over rates still flared, but the routine held. Pass the sound, pay the toll. Inland, the crown drew on the former church lands and on extraordinary taxes approved in council during emergencies. Careful husbandry of these streams let Christian III avoid the kind of desperate borrowing that had trapped earlier rulers in the grip of creditor cities. When he did borrow, he bargained from a stronger position, backed by predictable dues. Foreign policy followed the logic of consolidation. Spain under Charles V loomed as the champion of Catholic reaction, while princes in the German lands formed the Schmalkaldic League to defend Lutheran gains. Christian III sympathized with the League, but kept Denmark clear of its most dangerous wars, preferring to guard straits and borders rather than gamble fleets and treasure on distant campaigns. That caution turned on a simple cause and effect insight. Every ship sunk on the Elbe or the Weser was a ship that could not patrol the Øresund or carry orders to Bergen. When imperial pressure crept north, Denmark signaled readiness without committing to ruinous entanglement. Neutrality, when held with a mailed fist at sea, could be a policy of strength. The Navy became the visible arm of that policy. Earlier monarchs had used the old levy, calling free farmers to row and fight for a season. Christian III strengthened the royal fleet as a permanent instrument. Copenhagen's harbor, particularly the anchorage that would later be known as Holmen, saw expanded yards and storehouses. Gun founders and shipwrights learned from Dutch and German models while keeping the swift handling habits of the Nordic tradition. A paid cadre of officers began to appear, men whose careers turned on the crown's service rather than on seasonal obligation. With these tools, Denmark could chase pirates, escort convoys, and remind foreign skippers that the toll station at Helsingør was no mere suggestion. The new order had human faces. Hans Tausen, a monk turned reformer, preached the Lutheran message in Danish towns and helped shape the church ordinances' catechisms. Pater Palladius, as bishop on Zealand, visited parish after parish to remove images deemed superstitious, to encourage schooling for children, and to instruct pastors in preaching clearly. Their writings show a consistent theme: teach in plain speech, oversee with regular visits, and treat the parish as a community to be shepherded, not a revenue well to be drained. That ethic, for all its sternness, dovetailed with the crown's aims. A disciplined clergy produced literate subjects. Literate subjects produced reliable records and taxes. Education and urban life benefited from the calmer ground. The University of Copenhagen, founded in the late 15th century, had faltered during the Civil War. Christian III restored and reformed it in the late 1530s, recruiting scholars shaped by Wittenberg's methods. Latin schools in market towns received statutes that set curricula and hours. Craft guilds, long jealous of their privileges, were pressed to accept clearer rules of apprenticeship and quality. These changes might seem small, but each widened the state's reach into daily routine. A mason's guild that kept proper roles and standards could be taxed and mustered for fortification work. A school that taught a set catechism turned out clerks who could keep accounts in the same hand from Jutland to Scania. There were limits. Not every monastery closed at once. Some houses faded slowly, their lands leased to laymen while a remnant of brothers lived out their days. Not every peasant welcomed reforms. New dues and stricter oversight could pinch. In Norway, mountain parishes held to older customs longer, and royal bailiffs had to bargain rather than dictate. The crown's own need for revenue invited criticism when assessments rose in a bad harvest year. Christian III's strength lay in managing these frictions without letting them harden into rebellion. He understood that a composite monarchy survives by steady pressure and occasional concession, not by constant strain. The transformation also changed how Denmark looked abroad. With Sweden now a rival peering across the Baltic, diplomacy became a dance of caution and assertion. At times, skirmishes flickered over borderlands in Småland or along the Karelian frontiers by way of Swedish entanglements, but Denmark's main line held closer to home. Control the Sound, keep Holstein quiet, and make sure Norway's sea roads stayed open. The crown's administrative muscle made those lines easier to defend. Orders could be issued in common form. Supplies could be gathered with less waste. Legal disputes could be channeled into courts instead of exploding into feuds. Christian IV grew up in a Denmark-Norway that had been tightened and reorganized by Lutheran reform. He inherited not the wide northern union of earlier centuries, but a compact realm with working tax systems, a disciplined clergy, and a toll house planted on the throat of northern trade. He read that inheritance as a launchpad. If the crown could turn geography, shipyards, and skilled administrators into a single machine, Denmark-Norway might live not by conquest on land, but by commerce at sea. That conviction shaped his reign from first plans to last battles. His early moves showed a merchant's eye and a builder's patience. In Copenhagen, he pushed the naval base at Holmen from a serviceable anchorage into a permanent complex of yards, rope walks, storehouses, and gun foundries. A navy that once rose and fell with seasonal levies became a standing instrument, able to launch patrols in spring without waiting for makeshift crews. Across the harbor, he cut canals and raised warehouses in a new district he named Christianshavn, borrowing layout and techniques from Dutch engineers who knew how to carve order from water. Nearby, he sponsored a covered exchange, the Bursen, to bring merchants under one roof and accelerate deals. The message was plain. The royal city would be a place where ships were built, goods were traded, and contracts were written. Infrastructure was not only civic pride, it was strategy. Homan slips turned wood into hulls without begging foreign yards for help. Christianshavn's canals let heavy cargoes move under watchful eyes. The exchange signaled to traders from Hamburg, Amsterdam, and Lübeck that the crown wanted them to buy, sell, and store in Copenhagen. Each of these projects tied revenue to place. Dues collected at the Sound, rents from royal lands, and fees from market privileges flowed back into planks, cannon, and brick. Cause and effect ran in a loop. More ships made trade safer. Safer trade fattened toll books. Fattened books paid for more ships. The same logic reached into Norway. Christian IV backed surveys and charters that encouraged new mines, especially at Kongsberg, where rich silver veins were discovered in the early decades of his reign. The crown claimed a share of the output and, just as important, controlled the roads and rivers that moved ore to the sea. Timber, tar, and pitch from Norwegian forests fed the naval yards. Bergen and Trondheim thrummed as staples ports, shipping fish and timber outward and receiving grain and cloth. Fortresses such as Akershus were strengthened to secure harbors and to remind local magnates that the royal eye watched the gateways to the Atlantic. Here, again, the pattern holds. Resource sites, transport links, and strong points work together to make cash and to keep it flowing. But Christian IV's imagination ran beyond the Baltic and the North Sea. The age's great empires were building companies to reach Asia and Africa. He believed Denmark-Norway could take a place in that traffic if it moved cleverly. With royal backing, merchants formed the Danish East India Company in the second decade of the 17th century. Charter in hand, they hired captains, raised investors, and outfitted ships for the long run around Africa. The voyage was no parade. Storms, disease, and uncertain supplies haunted such attempts, and rivals from Portugal, the Dutch Republic, and England guarded their routes jealously. Yet persistence paid. A treaty with a local ruler on the Coromandel coast granted the Danes a small foothold at a place they called Tranquebar. There, amid palm groves and monsoon skies, the crown's flag rose above a fort and a counting house. It was a modest square on a very large board, but it mattered. The realm had planted a post in Asia, and the know-how that carried a squadron to India would serve in other ventures. Exploration to the west drew his eye as well. Hopes for a northern passage to Asia had never entirely dimmed. Christian IV sent the experienced captain Jens Munk to probe toward the Arctic and beyond. Munk's expedition pressed through ice and wind to reach the vast inland sea later known for Hudson's name, then wintered in desperate conditions near the mouth of a great river. Scurvy, cold, and hunger scythed through the crew. Only a handful survived to bring a battered vessel home. The attempt failed in its immediate goal, but it showed the crown's willingness to risk ships and men to map routes and test possibilities. In every case, the line runs the same way. A maritime state must learn by doing, and doing at sea is always paid for in risk. While merchants and captains pushed outward, armies and diplomats managed dangers close to home. The first great land test of Christian IV's reign came in the conflict known as the Kalmar War against Sweden. The quarrel grew from overlapping claims in the north and from a struggle over who would speak for trade in the Baltic. Danish forces seized the initiative with a bold strike that captured the Swedish fortress town of Kalmar and threatened to squeeze Sweden's coasts. Yet even a well-timed success could not erase the basic problem. Two ambitious monarchies faced each other across narrow waters, each learning quickly from the other's tactics. The peace that followed restored a tense balance. Denmark-Norway kept the symbolic advantage of royal titles that claimed lordship over the Nordic world, but Sweden's resilience warned that the old assumption of Danish primacy was fading. A far more dangerous gamble followed when Christian IV carried the banner of Protestant defense into the wide struggle later called the 30 Years' War. He had reasons. As a leading Lutheran sovereign and a holder of lands within the tangled German principalities, he feared that imperial victory in the empire would squeeze his borders and threaten the Sound. He also believed that his navy and his alliances could offset weaknesses on land. Early moves seemed promising. Then the weight of imperial resources, sharpened by the general Albrecht von Wallenstein, ground down Danish positions. Battles went against the Danish king, fortresses fell, and a victorious enemy looked toward the Baltic with hungry eyes. Defeat forced a reckoning. A hard peace cut Denmark-Norway down from would-be protector into a chastened spectator in German affairs. The cost was not only diplomatic. Armies are expensive even in victory. They are ruinous in defeat. The treasury struggled. Extraordinary taxes strained the patience of councils and towns. Repairs to fortresses and ships crowded out other spending. Christian IV learned what many rulers learned in that age. A maritime strategy that forgets the weight of continental war will find itself paying for both fleets and garrisons without having the resources for either. The lesson would echo through the rest of his reign. He did not abandon the sea. If anything, loss on land hardened his commitment to ships. He poured money back into Holmen, demanded tighter accounts from naval suppliers, and pressed for innovations in hull design and artillery. Dutch shipwrights and gunners advised. Danish and Norwegian craftsmen absorbed the methods. The crown began to think of the fleet as a system rather than as a collection of vessels. Magazines for powder, standardized shot, training for gunners, and rules for convoy duty that married merchant timetables to naval schedules. The aim was to ensure that customs officers at Helsingør could collect dues behind a visible wall of cannon, and that traders could trust the crown to keep pirates and privateers at bay. Private life and public ritual intertwined with these policies. Christian IV was a builder not only of docks and forts, but also of palaces and churches that broadcast a message of order and confidence. He raised a summer residence at Rosenborg with gardens that disciplined nature into geometry, and he supported the construction of the Round Tower to house an observatory and a university library. These works signaled a belief that knowledge, beauty, and power belonged together. An observatory atop a city church spoke to the idea that God's world could be measured and mapped, and that a learned clergy would serve a literate state. In an age of confessional tension, such symbols mattered as much as embassies. The final great shock of his reign came when Sweden, now a military power in its own right, sought to break Danish control of the straits and to seize advantage while Denmark-Norway was still recovering from losses in Germany. In the struggle remembered as the Torstenson War, Swedish forces surged across the borderlands and probed toward Jutland. At sea, the fleets met in a fierce engagement off the Schleswig coast near Kolberger Heide. In the smoke and roar of guns, Christian IV stood on the deck of his flagship, urging his gunners to hold their fire until the range closed. A splinter blinded him in one eye, yet he refused to leave the quarterdeck, rallying his crews by voice and presence. The battle did not deliver a decisive strategic victory, but it became a moral emblem. A king bloodied, yet unbowed, the navy still fighting, the straits not yet yielded. The peace that followed, concluded a little later at Bremsebro, cut again into the realm's margins, transferring border provinces to Sweden and pledging others for a term. The exact details belong to the next chapter's ledger of losses, but the direction is clear by the end of Christian IV's days. The Scandinavian balance had tilted. Sweden could now meet Denmark-Norway ship for ship and field battle-hardened armies on land. The old confident claim to regional leadership had become a contest. Even so, Christian IV's reign left tools that later rulers would need in darker hours. The navy was no longer an improvised levy, it was a permanent arm. Copenhagen was no longer a modest port, it was a planned capital with canals, an exchange, an observatory, and a naval base that anchored the kingdom's strategy. The East India foothold at Tranquebar gave the realm experience in treaties, provisioning, and long-distance trade that would be recycled when new companies were chartered for Africa and the Caribbean. Norwegian mines and forests were more tightly integrated into the fiscal system. The state had learned, sometimes painfully, how to command credit, manage stores, and plan multi-year projects. When Christian IV left the stage, he handed his son a rebuilt navy, a fortified capital, and a realm that still believed it could command the straits. Frederick III also inherited a neighbor transformed. Across the Sound, Sweden had sharpened its armies on continental battlefields and learned how to move fast, strike hard, and bargain from strength. The balance that once favored Denmark-Norway now wobbled. A single misjudged war would decide which crown set the rules in the north. The opening misstep was Denmark's choice to attack while Sweden seemed overextended. Swedish forces were campaigning deep in the Polish-Lithuanian lands, and the Danish council judged the moment favorable. War was declared in the summer of the year, spelled out as 1657. The calculation was familiar. Pressure a busy rival, seize ground along the southern Jutland frontier, and use the navy and the Sound dues to squeeze Swedish trade. But war is a chain of causes, and the first link snapped. Charles X, Gustav, the Swedish king, refused to be pinned in Poland. He wheeled his veterans back toward the Baltic with a speed that shocked observers and turned Denmark's gambit into a trap. Winter delivered Sweden a weapon no army could forge: ice. In one of the most daring marches of the century, Charles X Gustav led his troops across the frozen belts that knit Denmark's islands. The Great Belt and the Little Belt, straits that in warmer months favored Danish seamen, became roads for Swedish infantry and cavalry. Towns that counted on water as a moat woke to find enemy columns on their doorsteps. Panic spread through Zealand and Funen. With fortresses bypassed and the countryside shaken, Frederick III faced a brutal choice: risk the fall of Copenhagen or sue for terms while he still had a city to rule. The Treaty of Roskilde, signed in the late winter of the year, spelled out as 1658, cut deep. Denmark-Norway ceded Scania, Halland, and Blekinge on the eastern side of the Sound, fertile provinces that had long fed the kingdom's wealth and identity. Bohuslän went to Sweden, pushing the Norwegian border back from the Skagerrak. Bornholm in the Baltic and Trøndelag in Norway also changed hands, slicing into Denmark-Norway's reach on sea and mountain. The losses were not lines on a map. They were harbors, farms, toll stations, and recruiting grounds. The Sound, once a Danish-dominated throat, now had Swedish teeth on its eastern jaw. Why did these cessions matter beyond wounded pride? Because they shattered the geography that underwrote Danish strategy. Control of both shores of the Øresund had given the crown leverage over every hull that passed from Baltic to North Sea. With Scania gone, the toll station at Helsingør no longer stared at a Danish-held Helsingborg. Enforcement grew harder. Diplomacy grew more tangled. The army lost access to the Scanian cavalry base that had supplied horses and men. The navy faced a Swedish coast set with new batteries and watchposts. And the realm's political psychology changed. For generations, Danes had assumed that Sweden might be troublesome, but was ultimately containable. Roskilde taught a harsher lesson. The rival could dictate terms in the royal hunting lodge itself. Yet the catastrophe did not end there, because Charles X Gustav did not stop at what he had gained. He believed, and not without reason, that Denmark-Norway was broken. In the late summer and autumn of the same year, he tore up the fresh treaty and lunged again, this time aiming to finish the job by taking Copenhagen and erasing Denmark as a player. Swedish troops poured onto Zealand. The capital braced for a siege, with hastily repaired earthworks, guns dragged to ramparts, and citizens mustered beside soldiers. Frederick III, rather than fleeing, resolved to remain in the city. Contemporary accounts describe him on the walls in armor, rallying townsfolk and garrison alike. The message mattered. If the crown stood fast, the city would fight. The siege tightened. Swedish batteries hammered suburbs, cold and hunger crept in. Then, in the late autumn of that year, a decision taken far away shifted the balance. The Dutch Republic, whose merchants depended on Baltic grain and naval stores, saw in Sweden's bid to close the Sound a mortal threat to their trade. The States General ordered a relief fleet into the Øresund. In a hard-fought battle off the Narrows, Dutch warships, joined by Danish allies, battered through the Swedish blockade and reached the capital with supplies. The specifics of admirals and broadsides belong to naval historians. The consequence is clear. Copenhagen did not fall because the sea road reopened. Winter tested both sides again. In the deep cold of the year spelled out as 1659, Swedish commanders launched a night assault against the city's lines, hoping to crack the defenses before allies could gather. Citizens, students, artisans, and soldiers met them in the dark with pikes, muskets, and sheer stubbornness. The attack failed amid bursting grenades and desperate hand-to-hand fighting on the ramparts. That night joined the Danish civic memory. Not only the king, but the people had held the walls. The siege dragged on, but its verdict had been delivered. Sweden could not take the capital by storm. On the wider map, pressure built against Charles X Gustav. Other powers, wary of a Sweden that might dominate the Baltic, edged toward intervention. Inside Sweden, the cost of campaigns mounted. Then sudden illness removed the king himself in the early months of the year spelled out as 1660. Bereft of its driving will, the Swedish war machine lost momentum. Diplomats moved into the spaces guns had cleared. In the Treaty of Copenhagen later that same year, some wounds were stanched. Bornholm returned to Danish hands after a fierce island rising made Swedish rule untenable. Trøndelag went back to Norway, where the loss had brought hardship and resistance alike. Yet the eastern Scandinavian provinces, Scania, Holland, and Blekinge, and the strip of coast at Bohuslän remained Swedish. The modern frontier in the south of the peninsula took shape. The consequences inside Denmark-Norway were immediate and lasting. First, the realm had to live smaller. The permanent loss of Scania ended any plausible dream of rolling back to medieval borders by a sudden stroke. The kingdom's heart now lay fully on the Jutland Peninsula and the islands west of the Sound. That meant a tighter focus on the Øresund tolls, on Copenhagen's harbor, and on the integration of Norway's forests and fisheries into a shrunken, more deliberately managed whole. Second, the crown's finances were shattered. War had eaten revenue, ransoms, rebuilding, and garrison costs piled on. Creditors circled. The old arrangement, in which the nobility bargained tax grants in exchange for influence, began to look like a luxury the state could no longer afford. Third, political blame sought a target. Many townsfolk and lesser landholders believed the noble estate had misjudged the war, dragged its feet in defense, or shielded its privileges while commoners bled. The king's decision to stay in Copenhagen during the siege gave him a kind of moral credit that could be spent in later bargaining. If the realm had survived because crown and people stood together, why should the Council of Magnates still limit royal authority as it had in calmer days? The question did not yet overturn the Constitution, but it sharpened the debate that would fill the halls at the next great assembly. There was also a change in how the kingdom thought about power at sea. The Dutch intervention had saved the capital not out of charity, but out of interest. That fact taught a cool lesson. Alliances in the Baltic would be decided by commerce as much as by confession or kinship. If Denmark-Norway wanted reliable partners, it had to make itself useful to their trade and too costly to ignore. That meant keeping the Sound open, policing piracy, and maintaining a fleet credible enough to matter in any coalition. It also meant accepting that no northern state could monopolize the straits without provoking others to cut the noose. The age of solitary toll mastery was gone. The age of negotiated control had arrived. At the same time, the Swedish challenge forced Denmark-Norway to look again at its colonial and commercial sidelines. With the Scanian breadbasket gone, and with continental adventures now obviously hazardous, the crown's gaze shifted more decisively toward revenues less vulnerable to Swedish cavalry. The Sound dues, the regulated trades of Norway, and the chartered companies that were beginning to probe Africa and the Caribbean. These were not replacements for lost provinces, but they were cushions against future shocks. A krone taken from a sugar cargo or a slave ship's fee at a West African fort could not repair the loss of Lund or Malmö, yet it could pay a gun captain at Holmen or keep powder dry in a Copenhagen magazine. Human stories carry these structural changes. In Scania, families who had sworn loyalty to Danish kings for generations now paid tax to Stockholm, sent sons to Swedish regiments, and prayed under bishops answering to Uppsala. The law shifted. The language of officials changed. The universities at Lund and Copenhagen now served different crowns. On Bornholm, islanders who had risen against Swedish garrisons remembered the names of the men who fell in their streets and kept the returned Danish flag as a sign that local courage could bend treaty lines. In Trøndelag, farmers who had felt the hard hand of new masters saw familiar standards return and expected, rightly or wrongly, that the old rhythms of rent and duty would follow. Copenhagen itself bore scars and honors. The suburbs burned in the siege were rebuilt on firmer plans. The ramparts that had held were strengthened and extended. The Navy's base at Holmen expanded again, its sheds and slips crowded with carpenters, sailmakers, and gunners, drilling under stricter rules. Church sermons remembered the night of the assault as proof that Providence favored a people who defended their king and city. Guilds told the story to apprentices as a lesson in duty. A capital that had once been a busy port now saw itself as a bastion as well, a place where the realm's fate could turn in a single winter. Across the water, Sweden used its gains to reframe Baltic politics. With Scania and Blekinge in hand, Stockholm controlled a continuous southern coastline from the Kattegat to the approaches of the Eastern Sea. That belt gave Swedish fleets room to maneuver and bases to supply. It also placed Swedish customs officers where Danish officers had once stood. The two crowns now faced each other as near equals, each with a navy, each with allies among merchant powers, each wary of the other's next move. The old pattern, in which Denmark dictated and Sweden reacted, had flipped. The winter sieges and humiliating treaties left Denmark-Norway with a stark arithmetic, a smaller realm, wrecked finances, and a frightened political class. Out of that pressure came a constitutional earthquake. In the autumn of the year spelled out as 1660, Frederick III and his allies turned a monarchy bounded by aristocratic privilege into a hereditary, absolute crown. It was not a street uprising. It was a meticulously staged shift of power carried out in council halls and garrisoned squares, and it reshaped the machinery that would sustain a leaner but more effective empire at sea. Cause and effect ran in a straight line from crisis to change. The nobility had long guarded an elective monarchy, lending money in exchange for offices and exemptions. After the disasters, townsmen and clergy blamed noble hesitations, while common soldiers and citizens remembered the king standing on Copenhagen's walls. Frederick III read the mood. He summoned the estates, nobles, clergy, and burghers to the capital. The city was full of loyal troops. The court's jurists had their arguments ready. When the session opened, the burghers and clergy moved first, offering to abolish the old elective charter and to make the crown hereditary in Frederick's house. The nobles, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, saw their bargaining position collapse. Within days, the estates swore to the new order. Denmark became a hereditary monarchy. A few years later, Norway's status was aligned to match, binding both kingdoms more tightly to the same sovereign. The theory of that new order was written down in a document unlike anything else in Europe. The Kongeloven, often rendered in Latin as the Lex Regia, was promulgated in the year spelled out as 1665. Where other monarchies hedged their kings with customary checks, this law declared the Danish-Norwegian ruler answerable only to God. It set out the line of succession, fixed the indivisibility of the realms, and clothed royal commands with the force of law without need of estate approval. In practice, no king could govern without cooperation. Ships still needed crews, taxes still needed collectors. But the Kongeloven changed the default. When the crown moved, it moved from a place of legal strength. With authority consolidated, the court turned immediately to the problem that had wrecked earlier wars: administration. The old patchwork of councils and fiefs was replaced by a cabinet of specialized colleges. The chancery managed law and royal correspondence. The exchequer, known as the rent chamber, tracked revenue and debt. The war college and admiralty oversaw army and fleet. Later, a college of commerce took shape to steer trade and charter companies. Files multiplied, but so did clarity. Orders went out in standardized forms. Returns arrived in tabulated accounts. A modern state was being built with quills and ledgers. Personnel mattered. No figure shows the promise and peril of the new regime more than Peter Schumacher, elevated to the nobility as Count Griffenfeld. Brilliant, impatient, and tireless, he rose from obscure origins to become chancellor and the king's chief architect of reform. He rationalized the tax system, pressed for merit in appointments, and argued for a foreign policy that bought time for recovery. His vision was of a compact, centralized monarchy that lived within its means while leveraging the sound and colonial companies for cash. His fall, spectacular and swift after rivals accused him of corruption and treachery, reminded everyone that absolutism could devour its own designers. Yet much of his administrative blueprint endured. Money was the nerve of this state. The first step was a general settlement of debts and a reorganization of taxes. Extraordinary levies, which had been bargained piecemeal in earlier decades, gave way to more predictable imposts on consumption and trade. The sound dues at Helsingør were tightened with better record-keeping, standardized toll tables, and stricter enforcement. Customs officers logged a vessel's name, home port, cargo, and tonnage in neat columns. Disputes were adjudicated by printed rules rather than by shouted haggling. Inside the realm, officials surveyed crown lands recovered from the church and from defaulted noble mortgages, converting the produce of fields and forests into a steadier flow of cash. Law followed. The great Danish law code, Danske Lov, was completed in the year spelled out as 1683. It unified civil and criminal rules across the kingdom, replacing a maze of local custom with common standards. 4 years later, Norway received its own reformed code, Norske Lov. These books did more than tidy courtrooms. They taught officials what the crown expected in everything from inheritance to road maintenance, from market regulation to poor relief. A judge in Jutland and a sheriff in Telemark now spoke from harmonized texts. That harmonization lowered the friction of governing a composite monarchy spread over peninsulas, islands, and fjords. If the pen rebuilt the center, the keel protected it. The Admiralty, given stable funding and clearer authority, treated the Navy as a permanent organism. Holmen in Copenhagen grew into a true naval city, with rope walks, mast houses, powder magazines, victualling yards, and schools for gunners and pilots. Ships were grouped into squadrons with assigned stations and annual routines. Spring refit, summer patrol, autumn convoy. Gunnery drills were standardized. Stores were audited by checklists rather than by memory. Sailors and officers began to think of themselves as a royal service, not as a seasonal levy. In a realm whose leverage lay in a narrow strait, this mattered more than any parade ground. Absolutism also gave the crown freedom to experiment beyond Europe. Colonial ventures that had flickered under earlier kings were folded into a larger design. On the West African coast, Danish agents negotiated for forts among the trading towns of the Gold Coast. Fort Christiansborg at Osu, near Accra, passed under Danish control in the year spelled out as 1661, becoming the anchor of a small but persistent presence. From there, merchants bartered for gold, ivory, and, grimly, enslaved people, purchasing captives from African intermediaries who controlled the inland routes. The traffic was brutal and profitable, and it tied the realm directly to the wider Atlantic system taking shape. To organize that commerce, the Crown chartered the West India and Guinea Company in the year spelled out as 1671. This joint stock enterprise received monopolies in specified regions, rights to build forts, and the authority to appoint governors. In return, it paid fees to the treasury and agreed to sustain garrisons without constant dips into royal funds. The model pushed risk onto investors while keeping strategic control in Copenhagen. Within a year, the company planted a Caribbean foothold on the small island of St. Thomas, raising a fort and laying out a town. Sugarcane would take time to root. Enslaved labor would be imported to cut and mill it. A Danish Atlantic colony had been born under the sign of absolutist finance. On the far side of the world, the old East India project was revived. The Danish East India Company, first launched in the early 17th century, received a fresh charter in the later 1660s. Its aim was to secure the fragile holding at Tranquebar on the Coromandel coast and to reopen trade in pepper, textiles, and spices. Absolutist administration helped here in a practical way. Customs exemptions, convoy schedules, and credit guarantees could be issued quickly from the center without running a gauntlet of estate approvals. A small state, if nimble, could still find profit in the eddies left by larger empires. These overseas moves were not ornaments tacked onto a European policy. They were part of the strategy to live after territorial loss. Scanian fields were gone. The Sound's eastern bank no longer answered to Copenhagen. The Crown's answer was to turn state control and company monopolies into engines that could power a standing navy and a lean bureaucracy. Cause and effect again. Each toll collected at Helsingør, each chest of sugar from St. Thomas, each bale of cotton from Tranquebar, each bar of African gold, however small by the standards of giant empires, helped pay the salaries of clerks who wrote the orders that kept the strait working. The new state met its first great military trial a decade and a half after Roskilde. Sweden and Denmark-Norway clashed again in the conflict remembered as the Scanian War. This time, the re-engineered machine showed its strength. Fleets put to sea on schedule, magazines were full, officers knew their stations. At the Battle of Køge Bay, Admiral Niels Juel used disciplined line-of-battle tactics to shatter a larger Swedish force, proving that method and gunnery could beat impetuous courage. On land, fighting in Scania was bitter and indecisive, but the war ended without a new amputation of territory. For a kingdom that had recently been carved up, holding the line was a kind of victory, and it owed that result to the administrative spine built after 1660. Absolutism also reshaped society at home. The Crown sought to make the countryside more legible to tax assessors and recruiters. Land books were updated, parishes were surveyed, milestones and road markers multiplied to standardize distances. Clergy, now a state church, became the Crown's everyday messengers, reading royal ordinances from pulpits and reporting births and deaths in registers that doubled as population rolls. In towns, guilds were pressed to keep proper lists of masters and apprentices. Market days and weights were regulated to minimize fraud. None of this was flashy, but it was decisive. When a summons went out for sailors, officials knew where to find men of the right age. When a levy was due on a barrel of tar or a bale of cloth, inspectors had tables to consult. Foreign policy under the new order steadied. Frederick III's last years and his son Christian V's early reign leaned away from rash adventures. The court watched the rival across the Sound and cultivated ties with maritime powers whose merchants needed the Baltic. The lesson of the Dutch relief during the siege had been absorbed. Make yourself useful to the trade of others, and you win partners when danger comes. At the same time, absolutism made neutrality a more credible stance. A king who did not have to bargain every subsidy could keep fleets ready while avoiding entanglements that did not serve the strait. Symbols of the regime kept pace with its substance. Orders of merit, most notably the Order of the Dannebrog, founded in the early 1670s, rewarded service to crown and state, knitting officers, jurists, and merchants into a shared honor culture. Court architecture projected the same message. Baroque facades and planned squares in Copenhagen announced that order, measure, and hierarchy had replaced the improvisation of siege time. Public ceremonies, law codes proclaimed, naval victories celebrated, colonial charters presented, taught subjects to see the crown as the source of legality and prosperity alike. When the absolutist machinery settled into place, Denmark-Norway did not have the luxury of long recovery. The rival across the Sound still carried the momentum of recent victories, and Europe itself was sliding into a struggle that would pull every Baltic shoreline into its wake. The Great Northern War became the first major test of the new centralized state. What followed shows how a compact realm, rebuilt around the straits and a standing navy, could endure a continental storm and then turn inward to reshape its economy, culture, and institutions for a new age. The opening act revealed both caution and necessity. The court at Copenhagen had no desire to repeat the rash gambles of earlier decades, yet Swedish dominance under a young and energetic monarch threatened the very toll-house logic on which Danish strength now rested. Denmark-Norway entered the coalition that sought to break Swedish hegemony, only to be forced into an early climb-down. An initial peace stripped away the chance of quick gains and reminded ministers that the new order's discipline would be measured not by proclamations, but by patience. The realm bided its time, rebuilt fleets, and watched for a turn in the fortunes of war. That turn arrived when Swedish power faltered after a crushing defeat far to the east. Seeing the balance shift, Frederick the Fourth, son and successor of the king who had stood on Copenhagen's walls, brought Denmark-Norway back into the contest. This time, the state moved with the rhythm its new colleges and chancery had drilled. Requisitions issued in standard forms, magazines opened on schedule, convoys organized by the Admiralty without estate haggling. Campaigns on land were hard and costly. The enemy still fielded formidable soldiers, but the kingdom's war aim was modest and clear: secure the southern frontier and settle accounts in the duchies where Swedish allies had long offered mischief. At sea, method met daring. The name that endured from these years was Peter Wessel, ennobled as Tordenskjold. He was the kind of officer the reformed navy could now produce and promote: technically adept, quick with signals, relentless in pursuit. Off a narrow fjord on the Bohuslän coast, he pounced on a Swedish transport fleet, smashing escorts and seizing valuable stores in a fight remembered for cool gunnery and audacious maneuver. He later harried blockaded squadrons, forced their scuttling, and turned the Danish-Norwegian fleet into a tool of pressure rather than a mere shield. His death in a duel cut short a career that had already become legend. But his methods, discipline underwritten by centralized supply, remained in the service manuals and the pride of Homen. Diplomacy closed what battles opened. When the smoke thinned, Denmark-Norway achieved what its ministers had sought from the start. The rivals' grip on the southern marches was broken, and Ducal Schleswig was secured under the Danish crown. The neighboring duchy of Holstein, tied to the Holy Roman Empire, remained a complicated frontier tangle, but the most dangerous Swedish lever in Jutland was removed. The settlement did not expand the realm's map in spectacular fashion. Instead, it repaired a structural weakness. For a small maritime power, that kind of consolidation counted as strategic success. The cost, however, had been heavy. War loans crowded ledger columns, merchant ships lost to weather, and gunfire left gaps in the toll registers. Widows and orphans appeared on parish rolls that the state itself had taught pastors to keep. The absolutist promise had always been that a strong center could mobilize quickly and then restore stability. Now the crown had to prove it. The next decades would test whether a compact realm could turn from war management to social and economic reform without losing the habits of maritime vigilance that kept the Øresund open. Copenhagen became the workshop of that transformation. The Admiralty continued to treat the fleet as a year-round organism, yards humming at Holmen, rope walks tap-tapping, gunners drilling to measured cadences, but the city's skyline and institutions turned toward learning and trade. Frederick the Fourth and, after him, Christian the Sixth and Frederick the Fifth, each left marks that, together, read like a civic program. The capital gained rebuilt churches, a strengthened university, and a covered exchange thronged by brokers who wrote contracts in a Danish that clerks across the realm could parse. A new district of ordered streets and noble mansions rose around a square designed to display royal architecture and mercantile confidence side by side. Here, urban design played policy. Straight avenues meant faster movement of goods, wider quays meant easier convoying, and monumental facades taught subjects to see order as natural. Reform reached into parish schools. Under Christian VI, a pietist monarch who believed that a godly people should also be a literate people, the crown issued ordinances that pressed every community to maintain basic schooling. Children were to learn reading, catechism, and useful habits. Pastors were to inspect and encourage. The effect was uneven. Rural poverty cannot be cured by parchment, but the trend was steady. A generation later, merchants and officials alike could assume that more subjects could read a posted notice, decipher a ledger entry, or copy an order. In a realm that ran on written rules, elementary literacy was a strategic asset. Agriculture posed a different kind of problem. The countryside had long labored under arrangements that tied many peasants to estates and constrained movement. The crown, mindful of recruitment needs and grain supply, had earlier tightened those bonds rather than loosened them. That choice made short-term sense for musters. It bred long-term inefficiencies on the land. In these decades, ministers began to collect data, commission surveys, and encourage experiments in crop rotation, drainage, and enclosure on crown domains. Model farms were established. Prize essays were solicited on methods. A slow conversation began between estate owners, officials, and practical men of the soil. The most dramatic changes would not arrive until a later generation, but the habit of reform, measure first, legislate later, took hold. Trade policy likewise shifted from crisis improvisation to rules meant to lure commerce without surrendering control. The sound dues remained the beating heart of revenue, and customs officers at Helsingør kept their books with a thoroughness that makes modern historians smile. Ship names, declared cargoes, home ports, seasons. Yet the crown and its ministers recognized that strangling traffic would only push merchants toward overland routes or rival ports. Tariffs were adjusted with an eye to volume. Convoy systems were refined so neutral shipping could move under royal protection when European wars flared. During the great continental conflict known for 7 hard campaigning years, Denmark-Norway steered a neutral course and profited by carrying goods others could not. Neutrality in this usage was not passivity. It was a service sold at a premium, safe passage for hire. Overseas, the architecture of empire settled into clearer lines. On the West African coast, Fort Christiansborg, near Accra, functioned as headquarters of a narrow but steady trade network. Danish agents negotiated with African rulers, paid rent, and adapted to the politics of the littoral, buying goods and, grimly, captives. In the Caribbean, the small colony on St. Thomas expanded its sugar works and became the staging ground for 2 further steps that defined the century's middle decades. First, Danish authority spread to the neighboring island of St. John, where planters carved cane fields into slopes and erected mills powered by wind and by the labor of enslaved people. Second, the crown and its backers purchased the larger island of St. Croix from the French, bringing under Danish sovereignty a plantation space with more room for mills, cattle pens, and harbors. These moves did not make the realm a great Atlantic empire. They made it a committed participant in a cruel but lucrative system that linked African coasts, Caribbean fields, and European refineries in a single triangular rhythm. In the Indian Ocean, the Coromandel foothold at Tranquebar endured, with merchants packing bales of dyed cotton and pepper under the watch of a modest fort. Attempts to extend influence to the Nicobar Islands in the eastern reaches of the Bay of Bengal flickered on and off, hampered by disease, distance, and competition. Still, each experiment trained scribes and sea captains in the routines of chartered trade, contracts with local rulers, mixed crews, tropical provisioning, and the delicate arithmetic of profit in long voyages. Absolutist administration at home gave these far projects quick access to exemptions and orders. The Admiralty's convoy habits linked them to the Baltic lifeline. Culture and science colored the same canvas. The playwright and essayist Ludvig Holberg used wit to skewer pedantry and hypocrisy, offering city audiences moral instruction wrapped in laughter. His histories organized the past into narratives that suited a literate public rising in numbers and confidence. Scholars mapped coasts, cataloged plants, and improved instruments in an observatory that looked down from a round brick tower over the copper roofs of the capital. These were not luxuries. A merchant navy power needs reliable charts, and a state that rules by paper needs readers who respect reasoned argument. Enlightenment in Copenhagen spoke plain Danish and expected practical results. Foreign policy in these calmer decades displayed the temper the new order had been built to sustain. Ministers with long horizons, men of the Bernstorff family stand out, combined a cool neutrality with quiet bargaining. The lesson of the Dutch relief in earlier sieges had been turned into doctrine. Keep the straits open for all who pay, promise even-handed treatment, cultivate the goodwill of powers whose ships must pass Helsingør. When crisis flashed elsewhere in Europe, Denmark-Norway stayed out unless its lifelines were directly threatened. This posture did not please everyone. Warriors itch when the drums sound, but it made the toll registers fat and the shipyards busy. The human texture of the age emerges in smaller vignettes. A customs officer at Helsingør chalks a tally on a hull and calls for a clerk to enter the figure. A schoolmaster in a Jutland parish holds a winter class by the light of tallow candles. A naval lieutenant drills a gun crew through misfire routines with the same cadence his instructor used at Holmen. A planter on St. Croix measures a cane row with a surveyor's chain, while an enslaved gang, watched by an overseer, swings hose in the heat. A pastor copies births into a register that will, 2 centuries later, help a historian trace demographic change. Each moment sits inside systems the absolutist state had designed: standardized measures, written forms, predictable routines. There were shadows. The moral tension of the Atlantic trade did not pass unnoticed. Clergy wrote sermons that condemned cruelty even as planters counted profits. A few voices whispered about the clash between Lutheran conscience and plantation practice. At home, peasants bound by older labor obligations watched estate reforms with suspicion, fearful that improvement meant heavier hands. In Norway, timber inspections and new rules over salmon weirs felt like intrusions from Copenhagen. An efficient state is not always a beloved one. The Crown's task was to keep discontent within legal channels, to offer occasional concessions, and to point to the stability and prosperity that the system, at its best, delivered. By the later 18th century, Denmark-Norway had settled into the rhythms of a compact maritime power. The sound dues ticked like a clock. The Navy patrolled the Narrows, and chartered companies managed far posts on the Gold Coast and in the Caribbean. Yet the very system that funded shipyards and schools rested on a terrible foundation: the traffic in enslaved Africans and the labor of those forced to cut cane on St. Thomas, St. Jan, and St. Croix. In this period, profit, power, and conscience collided, and Denmark took steps that were bold by European standards and compromised by their timing. The kingdom became the first European state to legislate the end of the transatlantic slave trade, and later it proclaimed emancipation in its islands. But between those markers lay decades of tension, calculation, and human struggle. Begin with the economic engine. Sugar prices in the Atlantic world had climbed across the 18th century, and Danish planters, especially on St. Croix, invested heavily in mills, boiling houses, and irrigation. The island's flat plains and deeper soils made it the most productive of the Danish trio. The route was clear. Danish or neutral hulls carried manufactures to the Gold Coast forts around Christiansborg at Osu, purchased captives from African brokers tied to inland networks, crossed the ocean to the Caribbean to sell those human beings, loaded sugar, molasses, and rum, and then sailed to northern Europe where refineries waited. Customs taken at the Sound, fees levied at colonial ports, and dividends skimmed by Copenhagen investors turned into wages for sailors and salaries for clerks at Holmen. The system rewarded method. The West India and Guinea Company, and later reorganized forms of it, issued detailed instructions to factors on the African coast. how to keep accounts, how to inspect goods, how to weigh gold, how to judge the health of captives, how to repair palisades during the rains. In the islands, plantation codes regulated rations, punishments, work gangs, and Sunday markets where enslaved people might sell small crops from their provision grounds. Moravian missionaries, present since the earlier century, preached humility and salvation in simple language, taught reading to some converts, and urged masters to temper brutality. Their diaries preserve human scenes: a mother bargaining for her child's time, a man whispering a psalm in a cane field, an overseer pacing the veranda at dusk with a ledger under his arm. War and diplomacy spun the wider frame. During the conflict that North Americans remember as their war for independence, Denmark-Norway steered a cautious neutrality that allowed its ships to carry goods others could not. This neutrality, defended by a fleet that knew its channels and signals, fattened toll books, and kept refineries busy. Yet the same decades saw the Atlantic shaken by the Haitian Revolution when the enslaved of Saint-Domingue rose, fought, and founded a state. News traveled fast across warm seas. Planters in the Danish islands watched the flames on a neighboring shore and tightened discipline. Enslaved communities measured risks and opportunities with new eyes. Inside Copenhagen, a debate ripened. The most influential voice belonged to Count Ernst Heinrich von Schimmelmann, a powerful financier and minister whose family fortune was tied to sugar, but whose instincts toward reform were sharpened by arithmetic and by the mood of the age. He argued that the transatlantic trade in captives could be ended without destroying the islands if planters shifted toward natural increase, improving conditions just enough that births outpaced deaths. He also believed that Denmark could seize a moral and diplomatic advantage by moving first among European powers. Clergy, sympathetic to humanitarian currents, added arguments from conscience. Others supported the change for reasons closer to statecraft. The forts were costly, the trade was vulnerable to war, and the kingdom's strength lay at the Sound and in northern shipping rather than in constant Atlantic risk. The result was an edict issued in the year spelled out as 1792 that forbade the transatlantic slave trade by Danish subjects after a delay of a little over a decade. The delay was deliberate and revealing. In those intervening years, planters were permitted, indeed encouraged, to import as many captives as they could on the theory that once the trade closed, a larger enslaved population might maintain itself. The law, then, mixed real moral ambition with cold calculation. Even so, it marked a first among European realms. When the clock finally ran out in the year spelled out as 1803, Danish ships could no longer legally carry captives across the Atlantic. The forts on the Gold Coast still traded in goods, the islands still worked by bondage, but a legal door had closed. Cause and effect did not stop at law. Markets shifted under external pressures the crown could not control. The wars of the French Revolution and the age of Napoleon rolled across sea lanes. The Royal Navy, determined to strangle French power and suspicious of any neutral that might feed it, struck Denmark hard. Copenhagen was attacked, its fleet seized, and for long stretches in the early 19th century, the British occupied the Danish West Indies. During those years, British law, which itself banned the slave trade a few years after the Danish edict, shaped the traffic through the islands. Smuggling persisted around the edges, as it did everywhere in the Atlantic, but the legal regime had turned. Meanwhile, sugar economics began to change. European experiments with beet sugar gathered pace, and wartime blockades disrupted cane imports often enough to push investors toward domestic alternatives. Prices flickered. Planters in the Danish islands took on debt. Some estates consolidated while others fell into neglect. Enslaved people bore the brunt of these swings. When money was tight, rations shrank, clothing was delayed, and medical care thinned. The death rate told a steady, bitter story that no plantation ledger could hide. Moravian missionaries and a few Lutheran pastors pressed for better treatment. Some planters, frightened by the Haitian example and mindful of the new Danish prestige as a pioneer in ending the trade, adopted modest amelioration measures. Work hours were adjusted on the hottest days, families were kept together more often, punishment codes were softened at the margins. The fundamental fact, people held as property, did not change. In the metropole, the language of reform grew louder. Danish thinkers read and argued with British and German abolitionists. Copenhagen salons traded essays on rights and duties. Officials collected data on births, deaths, and punishments in the islands. In the year spelled out as 1847, the Crown issued a law that promised the end of slavery after a term of years, setting out a staged path that included apprenticeships and preparations for life as free laborers. The design was careful and slow. It aimed to protect planter property while guiding a gradual shift in labor relations. It also aimed to forestall unrest by offering a timetable. Events moved faster than paper. In the early days of July, in the year spelled out as 1848, word spread on St. Croix that freedom would be delayed. A crowd of enslaved people and free people of color gathered near Fort Frederick at Frederiksted, led by figures remembered in island memory. Among them, a man called Moses, often known by the nickname Budo, and a comrade named Admiral Martin. They rang bells, beat drums, and demanded an end to bondage now, not in a distant year. Plantations burned at the edges of the town. Overseers fled. The garrison weighed its options. Governor-General Peter von Scholten rode out to meet the crowd. He had served long in the islands, had seen the cost of repression, and understood that a bloodbath would poison the future. Standing before the assembled, he declared in plain words that from that day, the unfree were free. Von Scholten's proclamation ran ahead of the law. In Copenhagen, some ministers were furious. They recalled him to face inquiry, arguing that he had exceeded his authority and violated property rights. Courts would later acquit him, but his career was finished. On the ground, however, the fact stood. Freedom was a sentence spoken aloud, backed by the presence of the governor and accepted by the soldiers at the fort. The days that followed were messy and human. Families searched for one another. Some planters negotiated wages. Others tried to hold labor without chains by threats or by promises. The Crown soon issued formal regulations to stabilize the situation, including a provisional labor law that bound the newly freed to contracts and set wage scales, hours, and mobility rules. The paper tried to hold a social world in flux. Compensation became part of the settlement. The Danish state chose to pay planters for the loss of their legal claims over enslaved people, a policy echoed in other empires that moved from bondage to wage labor. The freed received no such financial grant. They carried only what they owned in their hands and the right to sell their labor where they could. On St. Croix, where estates were large and the best land lay behind plantation fences, that right was narrow. Many families stayed on the same fields under new contracts, hoping that wages, gardens, and schooling for children would build a different kind of life. Churches expanded their schools. Missionaries printed primers. Community leaders debated how to turn freedom into independence. When the century turned, Denmark-Norway still looked like a careful, compact maritime power. The sound dues filled the treasury. Homan's yards kept a disciplined fleet, and neutrality, sold as a service to Europe's traders, remained the realm's favorite posture. Then the long wars touched off by the French Revolution, and the rise of Napoleon rolled north. In a handful of harsh years, that prudent system shattered. Copenhagen burned under bombardment. The fleet was carried away. The money markets cracked. And at the end of the road, a treaty tore Norway from the crown. The shift remade the map and the mind of the kingdom. The first shock arrived in the year spelled out as 1801. Britain, fighting France and wary of any northern league that might hinder its blockade, ordered a squadron into the Sound. Denmark-Norway stood with Russia, Sweden, and Prussia in a loose association often called an armed neutrality, meant to protect non-belligerent shipping. British ministers saw in it a threat to their naval war. Admiral Hyde Parker led the fleet. His second, Horatio Nelson, pressed for a direct attack on Copenhagen's anchored defenses. The battle that followed ran close along the shoals and gun batteries that guarded the capital's roadstead. Nelson sailed into the kill zone with a line of ships chosen to draw the Danish fire, guns roaring at pistol range. When signals from Parker suggested withdrawal, Nelson famously lifted his glass to his blind eye and refused to see the order. After hours of brutal exchange, the Danish line sagged. The Crown, facing ruin if the fighting continued among civilians and warehouses, accepted an armistice. The result did not break the realm, but it broke an illusion. Even a drilled navy and stout harbor forts could be forced by a global power determined to keep sea lanes under its hand. For a few years, the kingdom tried to restore its careful balance. Trade resumed, and ministers in Copenhagen worked to keep the Sound open to all who paid the toll. Then came the second, deeper blow. In the summer and early autumn of the year spelled out as 1807, Britain returned, this time convinced that Napoleon would soon coerce Denmark-Norway into handing over its fleet. Rather than risk French use of those hulls, the British demanded the Danish navy at once. The court refused. London ordered bombardment. For days, shells and the new Congreve rockets rained on the capital. Warehouses burned, churches burned, houses burned. Civilians fled or crowded into cellars while embers fell through the night. At last, with fire eating the heart of the city and no hope of relief, the Crown capitulated. The British seized the entire battle fleet, destroyed what they did not take, and sailed away. That departure left more than emptiness at the moorings. Without a battle fleet, the kingdom's naval strategy had to be rebuilt from splinters. The Admiralty improvised a flotilla of small gunboats, shallow draft craft carrying a heavy piece or two, crewed by men who knew every creek and current of the inner waters. This gunboat war, a struggle of ambushes and sudden dashes in the belts and sounds, pestered British convoys and kept a kind of dignity alive after the capital's humiliation. Fishermen who could splice a rope in the dark became coxswains. Farm lads learned to run powder and shot under sail. A few sharp skirmishes, especially in summer squalls when larger enemy ships could not risk the shoals, gave the realm local victories. Yet gunboats could not replace a blue water fleet. They were a hedge, not a shield. Diplomacy narrowed with every season. After the bombardment, Denmark-Norway aligned with Napoleon. Britain, in turn, seized the Danish West Indies for much of the war and throttled northern shipping. Neutrality, the old business model, vanished. The Sound dues sagged with traffic. Customs officers at Helsingør filled ledgers with more blank lines than entries. Insurance rates for Baltic voyages soared. In Norway, timber exports and fish shipments suffered under blockade. In Denmark, urban workshops lacked imported raw materials. The Crown stretched credit to keep officials paid and soldiers supplied, but revenue streams ran thin. Money tells the story's next chapter. By the year spelled out as 1813, the financial system cracked. The state could not service its debts or meet obligations in sound coin. A currency reform followed, creating a new issuing authority and a new paper unit meant to steady trade and taxation. Prices lurched, savings evaporated. Contracts had to be rewritten in terms that tried to keep pace with the sliding value of money. For a realm that had prided itself on predictable measure, weights, dues, calendars, codes, the loss of monetary certainty felt like a civic wound. Parish registers filled with notes on scarcity, reports from provincial officials spoke of relief bread, of guarded granaries, and of the sharp edge where policy failed and hunger began. On the battlefield map, Napoleon's fortunes turned. As the French emperor's enemies gathered strength, Sweden made a decisive move that would shape the north. The Swedish estates had invited a French marshal, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, to their throne as heir, a soldier who knew how to read the European tide. As Crown Prince Charles John, he aligned Sweden with the coalition and fixed his eye on Norway as compensation for Sweden's lost Finland. The calculation was cold and clear. Break Denmark's tie to Napoleon, then pry Norway loose under cover of Allied victory. War flared along the Skagerrak and the wooded frontier. Norwegian farmers, drilled by their own officers and supplied as best they could under blockade, resisted Swedish probes with stubborn skill. The gunboat flotillas still nipped at British and Swedish shipping when weather allowed. But strategy is more than courage. With France collapsing and Britain commanding the sea, Denmark-Norway stood alone. Diplomats did what diplomats must do when powder and coin run out. In the winter of the year spelled out as 1814 at the town of Kiel, the Danish king signed a treaty that ceded Norway to the Swedish crown. Iceland, the Faroes, and Greenland, old Norwegian dependencies, remained with Denmark, a decision rooted in the treaty's phrasing and in the practical fact that Copenhagen still held them and Britain preferred that outcome. But the mainland union that had bound peninsula and fjords for centuries was gone. The treaty did not end events inside Norway. Norwegian leaders gathered at Eidsvoll in the spring of that same year, drafted a constitution, and chose a Danish prince, Christian Frederick, later Frederick VII, as their king, asserting sovereignty before the terms imposed from abroad could take full hold. Sweden responded with force and negotiation. A brief campaign ended in a compromise. Norway accepted a union with Sweden under a shared monarch but kept its new constitution and separate institutions. From Copenhagen's view, the effect remained the same. The political, military, and fiscal partnership that had anchored the kingdom's reach into the North Atlantic and given depth to its defenses had been severed. What then remained? A Denmark narrowed to Jutland and the islands, with Copenhagen as fortified heart, a set of Atlantic islands whose legal tie to the crown survived, small, costly colonies in the tropics, a navy being rebuilt from keels upward, and a bureaucracy that still functioned, even under financial strain. The mental map changed along with the physical one. The old title, King of Denmark and Norway, disappeared. The court's correspondence adopted a more modest tone. Pain turned inward and downward into culture and reform. Out of the shock would come a remarkable flowering of literature, painting, and thought, what later generations would call a golden age, as artists and scholars wrestled with loss, identity, and the meaning of a small nation in a large world. The loss also sharpened political questions that had earlier been blunted by absolutist habit. If a crown without estates had led the realm into ruinous wars and monetary collapse, should the crown still rule without formal consent? If the people of Norway could write a constitution in a handful of spring weeks, what kind of charter should Danes expect for themselves? Officers who had bled in gunboats and on frozen marches, merchants who had seen their ledgers erased by bombardment and bankruptcy, and farmers who had endured requisitions and scarcity, all carried grievances and hopes into a new decade. Strategists inside the capital drew sobering conclusions. First, never again should the realm gamble its fate on continental adventures for which it lacked the resources. Second, the best defense of independence lay not in territorial aggrandizement, but in a credible control of the straits, a carefully husbanded navy, and a fiscal system hard to topple. Third, the kingdom needed to simplify its far-flung commitments. Outposts that did not feed the core strategy would sooner or later have to be sold or reorganized. These conclusions did not instantly produce policy, but they set the frame for choices that followed. Human scenes fix the scale of the transformation. In Copenhagen, a woman sweeps brick dust from her doorway years after the rockets fell, telling a child why a church's spire looks new while nearby houses still show burn scars. On a Jutland beach, a gunboat crew hauls its craft under canvas to dry, the coxswain counting charges in a notebook that has seen too much rain. In a Norwegian valley, men fold a banner sewn for a regiment that will soon swear oaths to a different king. In a counting house near the exchange, a merchant scratches out figures, converts them into the new paper unit, size, and begins again. Each moment sits inside a story of contraction, from an armed neutrality that once worked, to a forced alliance, to defeat, to the bitter arithmetic of peace. The bombardments of the Napoleonic era left Denmark smaller, poorer, and sober. Out of that hard ground grew a different kind of state. The crown that had once ruled by decree now faced a society that wanted law it could read, representatives it could choose, and taxes it could understand. At the same time, the southern frontier smoldered. Two duchies, Schleswig and Holstein, sat between Danish and German worlds, bound to the crown by old charters yet tugged by new national ideas. In this section, constitutional change and border war moved together, and their consequences forced Denmark to rethink the last edges of its overseas empire. The first turn came at home. In the spring of the year spelled out as 1848, liberal revolutions shook capitals from Paris to Berlin. In Copenhagen, students, artisans, and townsmen petitioned for a charter. They wanted an end to absolutism, equality before the law, freedom of the press, and a parliament that could control taxation. The king, Frederick VII, read the moment with a mixture of caution and insight. He dismissed the old ministry and called for a constitutional plan. After months of drafting and debate, the June Constitution of the year spelled out as 1849 was proclaimed. Absolutism, born in the siege fires of the 17th century, was replaced by a constitutional monarchy. The new instrument was not a radical republic, it was a careful balance. A bicameral legislature took form. One chamber elected broadly, another elected on narrower property terms. Ministers were responsible for law and administration. Courts gained clearer independence, and a catalogue of rights set boundaries around state power: speech within limits, protection of the home, equality before the courts, and the freedom to form associations. The language mattered as much as the clauses. For the first time, a Danish king swore to a text that limited him, and citizens could point to printed words when they argued their case. The chancery that had once written orders now prepared bills and answered interpellations. A culture of debate took root. Even as pens scratched, guns cracked along the southern frontier. In those same spring weeks of 1848, a revolt broke out in the duchies. Holstein, tied to the German Confederation, declared against Copenhagen. Parts of Schleswig rose with it. Denmark mobilized. What followed, remembered as the First Schleswig War, lasted through campaigns and armistices until the year spelled out as 1851. Danish armies fought with determination, volunteers streamed to the colors, and naval forces cut sea roads that rebels needed. Diplomats maneuvered among great powers who wanted calm at the Baltic Gate. In the end, Copenhagen reasserted control, but the political puzzle remained unsolved. How could a constitutional Denmark integrate a bilingual, bicultural borderland without provoking either its German neighbors or its own national public? Ministers tried formulas. They proposed to bind Schleswig closer to the kingdom while leaving Holstein to its German ties, a so-called half-state solution. They redrew administrative lines, issued language decrees, and promised fair courts for all. Every step pleased one side and angered the other. Meanwhile, a different pillar of Danish power cracked for reasons far from the battlefield. In the year spelled out as 1857, a diplomatic settlement known as the Copenhagen Convention abolished the long-standing sound dues. For centuries, the toll at Helsingør had converted geography into gold. Now, under pressure from maritime powers who wanted free passage, Denmark accepted compensation and lowered its flag as tollkeeper. The treasury gained a one-time payment, but the steady revenue stream ended. The realm would have to fund fleets, schools, and railways without the old lever on Baltic trade. Overseas, the map narrowed in quieter ways. The Indian stations acquired in earlier centuries were poor fits for a small European state in a British-dominated Asia. In the year spelled out as 1845, Denmark sold its settlements at Tranquebar and Serampore to Britain. The forts on the West African Gold Coast followed in the year spelled out as 1850, also transferred to British hands. These sales balanced books and simplified commitments. They also signaled a new doctrine. The kingdom would keep only those outposts that either served the Navy's needs directly or carried a historic identity it could not abandon. That meant the West Indian Islands in the Caribbean, and it meant the North Atlantic dependencies, Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroes, that had remained Danish after the old union with Norway was broken. Back at the southern frontier, the constitutional trap snapped shut. The old king, Frederick VII, died without legitimate heirs, and the throne passed under a dynastic settlement designed to avoid a succession vacuum in the duchies. At the same time, Copenhagen adopted a new November constitution in the year spelled out as 1863 that tied Schleswig more closely to Denmark than Holstein. To Danish liberals, this move honored the nation's language and law. To Prussia and Austria, it violated European agreements and threatened German interests. Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian minister with a cold eye and a long plan, found his pretext. The Second Schleswig War opened in the winter of the year, spelled out as 1864. Prussian and Austrian forces crossed the border with modern rifles, skilled artillery, and staff work honed in drills that foreshadowed a new kind of war. Danish planners hoped to hold the old earthwork line of the Dannevirke, that medieval rampart stretching across the neck of Jutland. But ice and mud mocked romance. The position could not be supplied or defended under the enemy's guns. Danish commanders ordered a retreat north toward the positions at Dibble, near Sønderborg. The withdrawal shocked public opinion. Poets had sung the Dannevirke as a living symbol of national endurance. Military necessity is a dry comfort to a grieving nation. At Dibble, Danish soldiers dug in on a ridge under the fire of heavy siege guns. Day after day, shells smashed into the redoubts, splintering timber and earth, while engineers tried to repair under darkness. The assault came in the spring. Prussian columns, covered by a storm of iron, crossed the killing ground and broke through. Danish units fought stubbornly, counterattacked with bayonets, and yielded only when flanked and crushed. The army fell back across the narrow sound to the island of Als. A daring night crossing by Prussian troops forced even that refuge. The war had been lost. Diplomacy wrote the verdict at Vienna later that year. Denmark ceded Schleswig, Holstein, and Lauenburg to the victors. The realm's southern door, long contested and carefully administered, was closed against it. The loss cut deeper than territory. It stripped Denmark of fertile fields, busy towns, and a dense web of human ties. Families suddenly found themselves subjects of new rulers. Parish registers shifted languages. Customs barriers rose where none had stood. The political meaning was just as sharp. A small constitutional state had collided with the new iron politics of Central Europe and had been flung back. Shock often breeds reaction. In Copenhagen, ministers and voters argued about blame and remedy. Some conservatives pushed to tighten the franchise and guard what was left against radical experiments. Others insisted that only a broader, more representative system could rebuild trust. A revision of the Constitution in the year spelled out as 1866 narrowed the electorate for the upper chamber, giving landowners greater weight. The compromise kept parliamentary life alive but curbed the most expansive democratic hopes. For decades, Danish politics would wrestle with that tension. An elected lower house voicing farmers and townsmen, a cautious upper house, and a ministry that balanced royal prerogative with party strength. Economically, the defeat forced a pivot inward. If the sound dues were gone and the southern provinces lost, prosperity would have to come from better farming, smarter trade, and new industry. Railways spread across Jutland and the islands, tying market towns to ports and making it possible to move grain, cattle, and dairy quickly. A cooperative movement began to stir among smallholders who pooled resources to build creameries and slaughterhouses, standardize quality, and sell butter and bacon to Britain's urban markets. Agronomists preached rotation and drainage, and the countryside listened. The state that had once lived by tolls and colonial dues now learned to live by efficient fields. Culture helped heal pride. Writers, painters, and composers turned loss into identity. A school of landscape painting lingered over beach woods and coasts, suggesting that national character could live in light and shoreline as well as in borders. Folklore collectors preserved songs and tales from Jutland farms and island villages, teaching urban readers to hear the nation in rural voices. The universities and learned societies spared the ruin that befell the fleet in earlier decades, trained teachers, engineers, and agronomists for the tasks at hand. A different kind of greatness was being claimed. Not empire, but cultivation. Not tolls, but learning. The overseas map still mattered, but now as legacy and leverage rather than as a program of expansion. The Danish West Indies remained under the flag, their sugar economy wobbling in a world of changing tastes and laws. Debates began in Copenhagen about whether those islands served the national interest. Administrators struggled to manage labor relations after emancipation, maintain harbors, and balance budgets far from home. In the North Atlantic, Iceland pressed for more self-government, and the Faroes sought greater say in their own affairs. Greenland remained a special charge, tied to scientific exploration, missionary work, and the trade in fish and furs. These were not the engines of a grand imperial machine. They were responsibilities that touched identity and required careful, often costly, administration. The Army and Navy, humbled in war, rebuilt on new principles. The fleet could no longer pretend to dominate distant waters. It trained for coastal defense, mine warfare, and the protection of narrow seas. Fortifications around Copenhagen were modernized with earth and steel. Conscription laws were adjusted to share burdens more evenly, and officer schools taught the lessons of Dibble with a frankness born of pain. Drill books changed. Staff work was professionalized. Supply services learned to count as precisely as the old toll clerks at Helsingør once had. Foreign policy became a craft of modesty and persistence. Ministers accepted that the kingdom's safety lay in avoiding entanglements it could not control and in cultivating goodwill among maritime powers who valued a calm Baltic. The art was to be seen as useful, predictable, and harmless, a partner in telegraph lines, lighthouse standards, and quarantine rules, a signatory of conventions that greased commerce, a host for scientific congresses that carried prestige without risk. The same instinct that once had set careful toll tables now set careful treaties. Human lives trace the change in quieter lines. A farmer in northern Jutland sells milk to a cooperative creamery and reads a pamphlet on crop rotation printed in clear Danish. A clerk in the capital drafts a bill on schooling, citing constitutional articles by number and clause, spelled out in words in the official record, and sends it to a minister who must answer questions in the chamber. A veteran of Dibble, older and limping, teaches drill to village boys and tells them not of glory but of preparation. A pastor on the Faroes records births in a register that travels by packet boat to Copenhagen once a year, binding sea-scattered lives to a mainland archive. None of this looks like empire. All of it looks like a state learning to be itself after loss. The story of the Danish Empire enters its last act not with a single dramatic surrender, but with a series of measured exits and new beginnings. What had once been a wide, if slender, arch of possessions, plantations in the Caribbean, forts on the West African coast, trading posts in India, and the Old Norse outposts in the North Atlantic, was pared down until only the northern islands remained. In the process, Denmark built a modern identity, constitutional, maritime, European, and Arctic. The journey from colonial rule to partnership and autonomy is the thread that holds this final chapter together. The first unmistakable step came when Denmark sold its Caribbean islands to the United States. Negotiations had stretched across the previous decade, shaped by planter debts, hurricanes, and the hard arithmetic of administering distant territories whose sugar economy had long since declined. In a Danish referendum, voters approved the sale. In the spring of the year spelled out as 1917, the transfer was completed. St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix became the United States Virgin Islands. On the day remembered locally as Transfer Day, islanders watched the Danish flag come down and the American flag rise. For Copenhagen, the sale produced cash, reduced overseas liabilities, and signaled that the era of Danish tropical empire was over. In the North Atlantic, the picture was different. Iceland had already moved to a new legal status before the Great War's end, gaining sovereignty in the year spelled out as 1918, while remaining in a personal union under the Danish crown. War and shifting alliances then remade the North Atlantic's strategic map. During the Second World War, German troops occupied Denmark, while British and then American forces moved to protect Iceland and Greenland. Those occupations, undertaken to secure sea lanes and air routes, accelerated political change. In the year spelled out as 1944, Iceland declared itself a republic after a vote, ending the royal link. Denmark, still under German rule, acknowledged the decision after liberation. The split was peaceful, and the two countries maintained close ties. But another thread in the old composite realm had been cut. Greenland followed a different path. Administratively, it had long been treated as a special case, shaped by missionary history, trading monopolies, and the realities of Arctic geography. In the year spelled out as 1953, Denmark amended its constitution to end Greenland's colonial status and to integrate it as a county within the kingdom. In practice, that change brought schools, health services, and parliamentary representation closer to Copenhagen's norms, while also increasing the Danish state's responsibility for investment in a vast, sparsely populated land. Strategic calculation also played a role. In the early Cold War, the United States and Denmark concluded agreements that allowed an American airbase at Thule in northwestern Greenland, built to watch the polar approaches and knit into a web of early warning systems. Arctic sovereignty, Allied defense, and the welfare of Greenland's communities were now braided together. The Faroes traveled their own route. The islands had endured wartime isolation and direct British occupation during the years of danger, which deepened the sense of separate interests and capacities. In the year spelled out as 1948, Copenhagen granted home rule to the Faroes, creating a local parliament and executive with authority over many domestic matters. The Faroes retained their language, shaped their fisheries policy, and later chose to remain outside the European communities when Denmark joined. The principle at work was becoming clear. Within the kingdom, different lands could carry different legal relationships to Europe and different degrees of autonomy, so long as sovereignty and defense remained shared. Back in Denmark proper, the state moved to put its ruined century in order. The kingdom joined the United Nations in the year spelled out as 1945 and became a founding member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in the year spelled out as 1949, accepting that a small state's security in an age of air power required treaty guarantees and integrated planning. In the years that followed, ministries learned the rhythms of alliance, exercises, procurement, intelligence sharing, and the quiet diplomacy of keeping shipping lanes and straits open without provoking needless crises. The old art of being useful to maritime partners, once practiced through sound tolls and convoys, was reborn in a new register. Europe changed as well. Denmark entered the European Free Trade Association at the start of the 1960s and then shifted course, joining the European communities in the year spelled out as 1973 after a national vote. This brought access to a growing market, obligations to harmonize rules, and the delicate task of managing special arrangements for the North Atlantic. Greenland entered with Denmark, then chose a different course after years of debate over fishing rights and resource control. In the year spelled out as 1985, following a referendum, Greenland left the European communities and adopted a status as an overseas territory associated with the Union, preserving tariff access for fish while keeping control over local waters. The Faroes, never having joined, continued to negotiate fisheries and trade on their own terms. The kingdom's constitutional flexibility, one crown, several legal relationships, proved an asset. Inside Greenland, the logic of autonomy deepened. The Home Rule Act of the year, spelled out as 1979, transferred a broad set of domestic powers to Greenlandic authorities, including control over education, health, and local administration. 3 decades later, the Self-Rule Act of the year, spelled out as 2009, went further. It recognized the Greenlandic people as a people under international law, transferred control of mineral resources, expanded fiscal authority, and set out a process under which Greenland could, if it so chose and if its voters approved, move toward independence with negotiations over shared interests. Greenlandic language became the official language of administration. The direction of travel was not in doubt. More responsibility, more voice, and a clearer horizon for choice. These legal moves unfolded alongside debates over economy and identity. Fisheries remained the backbone of Greenland's income. The North Atlantic seas, warmed by currents and rich with life, demanded careful management of quotas and a relentless fight against illegal fishing. Royal Greenland, a state-owned enterprise, grew into a major processor and exporter, marrying local catch to global markets. At the same time, geologists and investors tested the promise and dangers of mining, rare earths, iron, oil, and gas, tempted by prices and technology, checked by fragile ecosystems and community concerns. Each proposal forced hard questions. Who decides, who benefits, and what risks are acceptable in an Arctic that is warming faster than the rest of the world? Climate change made those questions impossible to postpone. Sea ice retreated, shipping seasons lengthened, and the map of the Arctic slowly redrew itself. Denmark, acting with Greenland and with the Faroes, worked in councils where Arctic states coordinate search and rescue, fisheries, and scientific research. One notable moment came when the coastal states gathered to affirm that the law of the sea would govern future claims in the Central Arctic, an effort to preempt a scramble by agreeing on rules ahead of time. Scientific teams mapped the seabed to support submissions about the continental shelf north of Greenland, a technical process with strategic consequences. The kingdom's Arctic policy thus blended legal work, science, and alliance politics, always threaded through with the rights and aspirations of Greenlanders. Memory and reckoning traveled beside law and strategy. As the centennial of the Caribbean sail approached, Danes and Virgin Islanders marked the anniversary with ceremonies, exhibitions, and scholarship. Artists and historians told stories of plantation life, emancipation, and the long shadow of slavery. In Copenhagen, museums reinterpreted collections. Public debates weighed apologies, restitution, and the responsibilities of remembering. No single statement could close a ledger that stretched across centuries, but the conversation itself signaled a changed relationship between past and present. Empire was no longer a quiet footnote. It was part of a national story told aloud. In the Faroes, autonomy matured through practice. The local government managed fisheries, culture, education, and many social services, negotiated bilateral agreements, and maintained its own representation in certain international forums. Faroes leaders spoke openly about the long horizon of possible independence while making the day-to-day choices required to run a small island economy in volatile seas. The partnership with Denmark, meanwhile, remained close in defense, currency, and legal appeals. This blend of shared sovereignty and local rule, like the Greenlandic Path, illustrated how a former imperial center could become the frame for diverse communities rather than the command post over them. Denmark's own identity settled around three anchor points. The first was a social model that combined market dynamism with universal services. Schools, healthcare, and social insurance funded by broad taxation and managed by professional administrations that traced their habits back to the old absolutist chancery, now repurposed for democratic ends. The second was a maritime habit of mind, a navy sized for narrow seas, ports that handled global trade, and a bureaucracy adept at standards, lighthouses, pilotage, safety codes that make shipping work. The third was an Arctic role, a kingdom that thinks in two directions at once, south toward the European continent and north toward ice, fisheries, and the rights of Inuit communities. Security policy reflected those anchors. As a member of the Atlantic Alliance, Denmark contributed to shared defense while keeping a keen eye on the Baltic and the approaches to the Øresund. In Greenland, the Thule base and related installations remained part of Allied strategy, subject to periodic renegotiation and local debate. Danish governments learned to act as brokers between American strategic needs and Greenlandic community interests, between European rules and Faroes fisheries, between scientific caution and commercial appetite. The skill required was less imperial command than patient mediation. Human moments make these structures real. In Nuuk, a Greenlandic assembly member speaks in Greenlandic about a mining bill, then switches to Danish to address visiting officials, moving between languages as easily as between worlds. In Tórshavn, A pharaoh's trawler captain watches weather windows and market prices, coordinating with a co-op that has roots in village kinship and modern finance. In Copenhagen, a curator explains to school children why a sugar boiler's copper pan sits beside a banner from an emancipation celebration, and a law student reads a debate in which parliamentarians spell out, clause by clause, how to share revenue from Arctic resources. The empire survives here only as memory and as structure, a set of institutions repurposed to sustain equal citizenship and negotiated autonomy. Even the old tollkeeper's instinct finds a lawful successor. Though the sound dues were abolished in the 19th century, the idea that Denmark's geography imposes obligations endures. Pilots guide ships through narrow waters. Environmental authorities monitor ballast and emissions. Icebreakers and rescue services stand ready when winter and accident test judgment. These are not rents extracted at gunpoint. They are services offered by a state that understands the sea as its workplace and responsibility. By the opening decades of the 21st century, the Kingdom of Denmark consisted of three partners: Denmark on the European plain with its islands and straits, Greenland striding across the Arctic with its own parliament and language, and the Faroes steering a fishery-rich archipelago with home rule. Each part sent representatives to the kingdom's parliament in Copenhagen. Each managed a large share of its own affairs. Each argued, sometimes sharply, for its interests. And each recognized that certain questions, defense, currency, and the crown, were shared. The old empire had become a constitutional commonwealth. What endures across this long arc is not a chain of colonies, but a set of habits born from the sea. Turn geography into advantage without abusing it. Build institutions that remember. Keep partners because they need your lanes open and your rules predictable. And, when the moral weather changes, change with it. Those habits carried Denmark from Viking halls to Baltic forts, from sound tolls to chartered companies, from plantation ledgers to emancipation edicts, and finally from centralized empire to negotiated autonomy in the North Atlantic. In the next step, we bring the whole story together, tracing the through lines, maritime power, law, commerce, and conscience, that explain how a small kingdom outlasted empires far larger than itself.